Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little darker. Before we explore this absolutely delightful journey through medieval justice, let me ask you something. Have you ever complained about getting a parking ticket? Or maybe whined about spending a night in county jail for, I don't know, public intoxication? Well, buckle up, Buttercup, because tonight we're traveling back to a time when stealing a loaf of bread didn't just cost you a fine, it cost you your hand, literally, with a rusty axe in front of a cheering crowd, while your kids watched. But hey, don't worry, I'm sure you would have been one of the good ones, right? Never would have stolen anything, never would have spoken out of turn, never would have accidentally looked at a nobleman's wife for 0.3 seconds too long, cause that last one, that could get you hanged. Yes, really. So grab your favorite blanket, dim those lights, and let's ease into this absolutely horrifying but fascinating world together. And before we start, smash that like button if you enjoy sleeping peacefully, knowing you weren't born 700 years ago. Trust me, by the end of this story, you'll be kissing your smartphone and thanking every deity you can think of for modern civilization. When stealing bread cost your hand, picture this. It's 3047, you're living in what's now England, and you're starving. Not I skipped lunch, starving. We're talking I haven't eaten in 3 days, and my children are crying, starving. The plague has been making its rounds, crops have failed, and your lord, you know, the guy who owns literally everything, including you, has been too busy playing dress up in his castle to care about feeding his peasants. So you see a loaf of bread sitting unattended at the market, just sitting there, mocking you. Your stomach is literally eating itself, your family is on the verge of collapse, and this bread could mean the difference between life and death. What do you do? If you said steal it, congratulations, you've just committed what medieval society considered a crime worthy of permanent disfigurement. Because in medieval times, theft wasn't just illegal, it was a direct assault on the social order that kept everyone in their proper place. And society had a very creative way of making sure you never forgot your lesson. The punishment? Public amputation, not in a sterile hospital with anesthesia and skilled surgeons. We're talking about the town square, with a crowd gathering like it's the medieval equivalent of Netflix. The executioner would tie you to a wooden block, raise his axe, and thwack. But here's where it gets even more charming. The crowd would actually cheer. Medieval people treated public punishments like we treat sports games. They'd bring their children. Come on kids, let's go watch the hand chopping. Educational and entertaining. And you know what the really twisted part was? After they cut off your hand, they'd often cauterize the wound with a red-hot iron to prevent you from bleeding to death. What? Not out of mercy, they didn't want you dying too quickly. They wanted you to live with your shame, to serve as a walking advertisement for what happens when you step out of line. Justice was just a lord's mood. Now you might be thinking, surely there was some kind of legal process, right? Some way to defend yourself. Oh, you sweet summer child, let me introduce you to medieval due process. Your trial would go something like this. You'd be dragged before the lord or his representative, probably while still bleeding from wherever they grabbed you. There'd be no lawyers, no jury of your peers, no presumption of innocence. The lord would look at you, maybe ask a question or two if he was feeling particularly generous that day, and then render his verdict based on, well, whatever he felt like. Was he in a good mood because his favorite horse won a race? Lucky you, maybe you'd just lose a finger instead of the whole hand. Did his wife burn his breakfast that morning? Congratulations, you're about to become significantly lighter by exactly one appendage. The beautiful part was that this system was considered perfectly fair and moral by medieval standards. Why? Because lords were believed to be appointed by God himself. Their word wasn't just law, it was literally divine will made manifest. Questioning their judgment wasn't just illegal, it was blasphemous. So when Lord Edmund the unnecessarily cruel decided that you needed to lose your hand for stealing bread, that wasn't just his opinion, that was God speaking through him. And who are you, a lowly peasant covered in mud and probably several species of parasite, to question the Almighty? Welcome to your worst nightmare. But wait, it gets better, because theft was just the beginning of medieval creativity when it came to punishment. See, medieval society had a punishment for everything. Spoke out of turn, there's a punishment for that. Gossiped about your neighbor, special punishment. Looked at someone wrong, you guessed it, punishment time. And the thing about medieval punishment was that it wasn't just about stopping crime, it was about entertainment, social control, religious expression, and psychological warfare, all rolled into one delightful package. Every public punishment was a reminder to everyone watching, this will be you if you step out of line. So smile, keep your head down, and maybe we won't have to get creative with your body parts. The medieval mind had this absolutely charming belief that physical punishment wasn't just about justice, it was about saving souls. They literally thought that by inflicting excruciating pain on your body, they were helping to purify your spirit. It was like spiritual therapy, but with more screaming and significantly less success rate. So as we embark on this journey together through the twisted labyrinth of medieval justice, remember this: every single punishment we're about to explore was considered not just legal, but morally righteous by the people who inflicted it. They went to church on Sunday, said their prayers, and honestly believed they were doing God's work when they tied you to a post and did unspeakable things to your various appendages. Pleasant dreams, right? But don't worry, we're just getting started, because if you think losing a hand for stealing bread was bad, wait until you hear what they did to people who committed the absolutely heinous crime of talking too much. Now I need to ask you something important. Do you believe in fairness? You know, the radical concept that people should be treated equally under the law, regardless of their social status, wealth, or how much their breath smells like rotting fish. If you answered yes, then congratulations. You would have been considered a dangerous revolutionary in medieval times. The Lord's word was law. Let me paint you a picture of medieval justice that'll make you appreciate your local traffic court judge like never before. Imagine living in a world where the law isn't written down anywhere, isn't consistent from day to day, and changes entirely based on one person's mood, and that person happened to wake up on the wrong side of his feather bed. Meet your local lord. Let's call him Sir Reginald the Randomly Wrathful. Sir Reginald owns everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. The land you live on? His. The house you sleep in? His. The crops you grow? His. The air you breathe? Well, technically his, but he's gracious enough not to charge you for it, yet. Now Sir Reginald's idea of justice is refreshingly simple. Whatever he says goes. No complicated legal procedures, no lengthy appeals process, no constitutional amendments, just pure unadulterated autocratic whimsy. Did you accidentally let your pig wander onto his property? That's a crime. Did you fail to bow deeply enough when he rode past? Crime. Did you exist in a way that mildly annoyed him on a Tuesday? Believe it or not, also a crime. But here's the really fun part. Sir Reginald doesn't even have to be consistent with his punishments. Yesterday he might have fined someone a chicken for the exact same offense that today earns you a public flogging. Why? Because yesterday he was in a good mood after his favorite jester told him a particularly amusing joke about peasants falling into wells. Today his hemorrhoids are acting up. The medieval legal system was basically like playing a video game, where the rules change every time you respawn. Except instead of losing lives, you lose actual pieces of your body. And there's no reset button. And the game master might decide you're cheating just because he doesn't like your face. Mirrored this world through human cruelty. But wait, there's more, because medieval people didn't just accept this system grudgingly. They actually believed it was divinely ordained. See, according to medieval theology, God had established a great chain of being that put everyone in their proper place. God at the top, then angels, then kings, then lords, then knights, then merchants, then craftsmen, then peasants, and finally at the very bottom, people who asked too many questions about why this system made sense. This meant that when Sir Reginald decided your punishment, he wasn't just making stuff up. He was channeling the divine will of the Almighty. Every brutal sentence was basically God's way of correcting your sinful behavior. Got your tongue cut out for spreading rumor? Thank the Lord for this opportunity to learn silence. Had your ears nailed to a post for eavesdropping? Praise Jesus for this lesson in minding your own business. The church fully supported this system because frankly it worked out pretty well for them too. Bishops and abbots were often just as wealthy and powerful as secular lords, and they had their own courts with their own special punishments for crimes against religious law. Missed Sunday service, punishment. Ate meat on Friday, punishment. Suggested that maybe priests shouldn't be living in luxury while peasants starved. Extra special punishment with a side of excommunication. And if you were unfortunate enough to be accused of heresy, basically thinking any thoughts that the church hadn't pre-approved, Well, let's just say they had some very creative ways of helping you see the error of your way. We're talking about techniques that would make modern horror movie directors take notes. The brilliant thing about combining religious authority with legal power was that it made rebellion not just illegal, but literally satanic. If you questioned the system, you weren't just challenging human authority, you were defying God himself, and everyone knew what happened to people who defied God. Eternal damnation, fire and brimstone, and probably some very uncomfortable conversations with demons. Performance art disguised as justice. Now here's where medieval justice gets really interesting, and by interesting I mean absolutely horrifying. See, punishment in medieval times wasn't just about deterrence or rehabilitation. Spoiler alert, there was no rehabilitation. It was about putting on a show. Every public punishment was carefully choreographed theatre designed to reinforce social hierarchies and keep everyone in their place. The scaffold wasn't just a place of execution, the executioner wasn't just doing a job, he was performing a role. And you lucky you weren't just being punished, you were starring in a morality play designed to educate the masses about the consequences of stepping out of line. Picture the scene, it's market day. The town square is packed with people who've come to buy bread and vegetables, and suddenly the town crier announces that there's going to be a punishment. Drop everything, folks, we've got entertainment. Merchants abandon their stalls, housewives leave their shopping, children grab the best viewing spots, and everyone gathers around the scaffold like it's the medieval equivalent of a rock concert. The accused, let's say it's you because why not, gets marched out in chains while the crowd evaluates your performance. Are you crying enough to show proper remorse? Are you maintaining enough dignity to demonstrate that you accept your punishment as just? Are you putting on enough of a show to keep everyone entertained? It's like American Idol, but instead of singing for votes, you're suffering for the amusement of people who consider watching someone lose body parts a perfectly reasonable way to spend their afternoon. And the crowd participation. Medieval audiences were not passive observers. They cheered for particularly creative punishments, booed if they thought the sentence was too lenient, and occasionally threw things if the show wasn't entertaining enough. Sometimes they'd even make requests, cut off the other hand too, make him dance. Can we see the gibbet next? The authorities loved this because every public punishment reinforced their power while providing free entertainment for the masses. It was like social media before social media existed, a way to publicly shame people while ensuring that everyone got the message about what happened to troublemakers. But here's the really twisted part. This system actually worked pretty well for maintaining social order. When everyone knows that stealing an apple could result in losing a hand in front of their entire community, people tend to think twice about stealing apples. When everyone's seen what happens to people who speak out against authority, people tend to keep their complaints to themselves. Medieval justice wasn't broken. It was working exactly as intended. It wasn't about rehabilitation or fairness or any of those modern concepts that make us feel good about ourselves. It was about control, power, and making sure that everyone knew their place in the great medieval hierarchy. And now that you understand how the system worked, you're probably thinking, well, at least it couldn't get much worse than chopping off hands for stealing bread, right? Oh, my sweet, naive friend. We haven't even gotten to the really creative stuff yet, because medieval people had some truly inventive ideas about what constituted a crime worthy of punishment. For instance, did you know that talking too much could literally get your tongue pierced? No? Well, you're about to learn all about it. Have you ever taken something that didn't belong to you? Maybe a pen from work, a packet of sugar from a restaurant, your roommate's leftover pizza that they clearly weren't going to eat anyway. If you answered yes to any of these, congratulations, you would have been a prime candidate for some truly spectacular medieval punishment. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely they had some sense of proportionality? Surely the punishment matched the crime? Oh, you delightful optimist. Let me introduce you to medieval logic, where stealing a crumb of bread was basically equivalent to murdering the king's favorite horse. A hand that stole never stole again. Let's really dig into this hand-chopping business, because it's important to understand just how thoroughly medieval society had thought this through. See, losing your hand wasn't just about the immediate agony, though trust me, we'll get to that delightful detail in a moment. It was about creating a walking advertisement for the rest of your natural life. Picture yourself in medieval England, circa. You've just committed the absolutely heinous crime of, let's say you stole a loaf of bread. Not a golden loaf studded with diamonds, just regular bread. The kind that's probably half sawdust and entirely infested with weevils, but bread nonetheless. Now here's how your punishment would unfold, step by agonizing step. First, you'd be dragged to the town square, not gently escorted, dragged. The whole point was to maximize your humiliation before the actual punishment even began. They'd strip you to the waist, because dignity was apparently another luxury you'd forfeited along with your hand, and tie you to what they charmingly called the punishment block. The executioner, let's call him Big Eddie the appendage remover, would then inspect his tool. Medieval axes weren't exactly precision instruments. They were more like chunks of metal attached to wooden handles and sharpened occasionally when someone remembered. Big Eddie would heft his axe, test its weight, maybe take a few practice swings just to build suspense. The crowd would murmur appreciatively, like they were watching a chef prepare their dinner, and then, whack, one swing, ideally. Of course, medieval axes being what they were, it sometimes took 2 or 3 attempts. Sometimes Big Eddie would have a bad day and accidentally hit bone instead of joint. Sometimes the axe would stick halfway through and require some creative problem solving. The crowd didn't mind. If anything, they appreciated the extra entertainment value. But here's the really charming part. They'd immediately cauterize your stump with a red-hot iron. Not out of mercy, mind you. They just didn't want you bleeding to death before you'd had a chance to serve as an example to others. The smell of burning flesh would fill the air. You'd probably pass out from the pain, and the crowd would give Big Eddie a round of applause for a job well done. Finger-cutting ceremonies. Now, if you were really lucky, and by lucky I mean you'd stolen something really insignificant, like a single apple or maybe just looked at food with excessive longing, you might only lose a finger or two instead of your entire hand. Medieval society was nothing if not proportional in their disproportional punishments. The finger-cutting ceremony was like hand removal's annoying little brother, slightly less dramatic, but still guaranteed to ruin your day and every day thereafter. They'd tie you to a smaller block budget punishment for budget crimes, and instead of Big Eddie with his theatrical axe, you'd get his assistant, Little Eddie with a cleaver. The process was essentially the same, just more intimate. Little Eddie would grab your hand, select the offending finger, usually the index finger, because that's what you'd use to point at the thing you wanted to steal, and chop. One quick motion, ideally. Though Little Eddie was still learning the trade, so sometimes it took a few attempts. Practice makes perfect. The interesting thing about finger removal was that it was designed to be just debilitating enough to make your life significantly harder without completely destroying your ability to work. You could still hold things, sort of. You could still do manual labor kind. But every single day for the rest of your life you'd struggle with simple tasks that everyone else took for granted. Try buttoning your shirt with a missing index finger. Try holding a quill pen. Try doing literally anything that requires fine motor control. And everyone who saw your mangled hand would immediately know what you'd done. There was no hiding it, no explaining it away. You were branded for life as someone who'd transgressed against the natural order of things. Job interviews became rather awkward when you had to explain why you were missing essential body parts. The crowd always cheered, but perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these punishments wasn't the physical mutilation, it was the fact that they were considered prime entertainment. Medieval people didn't have Netflix, video games or even books for the most part. So when someone was scheduled to lose body parts in the town square, it was basically the Super Bowl of local entertainment. Families would pack picnic lunches and make a day of. Children would sit on their father's shoulders to get a better view of the carnage. Vendors would set up stalls selling food and drink to the crowds. Hot pies. Get your hot pies here. Perfect snack food while watching a hand removal. The crowd participation was truly something to behold. They'd cheer when the axe came down, gasp appreciatively at particularly clean cuts, and boo if they thought the punishment was too lenient. Sometimes they'd even make suggestions to the executioner: take off both hands, cut slower, make it more dramatic. And the social pressure to attend these spectacles was enormous. If you didn't show up to watch your neighbor lose a hand, people would start wondering why. Were you sympathetic to criminals? Were you perhaps harboring criminal thoughts yourself? Better show up and cheer with everyone else, just to prove your loyalty to law and order. The really twisted part was that this crowd mentality actually served a psychological function. By making everyone complicit in the punishment, by making them witnesses and participants rather than just passive observers, the authorities ensured that the entire community bought into the system. It wasn't just Big Eddie chopping off hands, it was the will of the entire town being carried out. Parents would bring their children specifically to teach them lessons about right and wrong. See what happens to thieves, little Johnny. Remember this the next time you're tempted to take something that doesn't belong to you. Child psychology at its finest. And you know what the most horrifying part is? It worked. Medieval communities had remarkably low rates of petty crime. not because people were naturally more virtuous, but because everyone had seen exactly what happened to people who got caught breaking the rule. When the consequence of stealing bread is losing your hand in front of everyone you know, you tend to find alternative solutions to your hunger problems. But don't worry, we're just getting warmed up here, because while hand removal was certainly dramatic, medieval society had even more creative punishments for other types of transgressions. For instance, did you know that talking too much, particularly if you were a woman, could result in having metal contraptions locked onto your head? No. Well, prepare to learn about one of history's most sexist torture devices. The beautiful thing about medieval justice was its consistency. It was consistently terrible for everyone, except the people in charge. But some crimes were considered so particularly heinous that they required special attention. Crimes like having opinions, speaking those opinions out loud, and worst of all, being a woman who had opinions and wasn't afraid to share them. Are you ready to learn about what happened when medieval society decided that your mouth was the problem? Because trust me, their solutions were creative. How many times a day do you speak? How many words do you use? How many opinions do you share? If you're like most people, you probably use thousands of words every day without giving it a second thought. Well, prepare to appreciate your tongue like never before, because we're about to learn what happened to people who used theirs too freely in medieval times. The price of speaking truth. Let's set the scene. It's 1425, you're living in a charming medieval village, and you've just witnessed something that really bothers you. Maybe you saw a local official taking bribes. Maybe you noticed that the priest has been living suspiciously well while his congregation starves. Maybe you observed that the Lord's new taxes seem designed more to fund his gambling habit than to protect the community. So you do what any reasonable person would do. You mention it to your neighbors. Not in a rebellious way, mind you. Just casual conversation. Hey, did you notice that Brother Francis seems to have an awful lot of gold crosses for someone who's supposed to have taken a vow of poverty? Just an observation, just a comment, just words. Congratulations, you've just committed one of medieval society's most serious offenses, speaking truth to power, and medieval authority figures had some very creative ways of ensuring that you never made that mistake again. The first step in your punishment journey would be your arrest, not by trained police officers following proper procedures, but by whoever the local authority figure felt like sending. Maybe the Lord's personal guards, maybe some local thugs who owed him money, maybe just whoever happened to be standing around with nothing better to do. Due process was more of a guideline than a rule. Then came your trial, which I use the term trial very loosely. You'd be dragged before whatever authority figure you'd offended, the Lord, the priest, the town mayor, whoever, and they'd ask you a simple question. Did you say what we think you said? Now here's where it gets interesting. If you said no, you were lying, which was also a crime. If you said yes, you were admitting guilt, which made the rest of the process much simpler. If you tried to explain the context or justify your statement, you were being argumentative, which was, you guessed it, also a crime. Medieval legal systems were remarkably efficient at turning any possible response into evidence of guilt. Once your guilt was established, and it always was, the punishment phase could begin. And for crimes of speech, medieval justice had developed some particularly artistic solution. Piercing rituals at dawn. The most common punishment for crimes of the tongue was, logically enough, tongue mutilation. Now, medieval people weren't savages. They didn't just hack your tongue off willy-nilly. That would be wasteful. No, they had developed sophisticated techniques for modifying your tongue in ways that would make speaking difficult without completely eliminating your ability to work. The standard procedure involved what they called tongue piercing, though it was quite different from modern body modification. We're not talking about a small hole for jewelry. We're talking about driving a red-hot iron spike through your tongue and leaving it there until the wound healed around it. The ceremony typically took place at dawn, because nothing says justice like getting up early to watch someone suffer. You'd be tied to a post in the town square, your mouth forced open with wooden blocks, and your tongue pulled out with iron tongs. The crowd would gather, because of course they would, bringing their breakfast and their children. The executioner would heat his iron spike in a brazier until it glowed cherry red. The smell of hot metal would fill the air. Your tongue would be held steady by assistants, usually local volunteers who wanted to participate in the justice process. And then, the spike would be driven through your tongue with the satisfying hiss of flesh meeting molten metal. The pain was described by witnesses as beyond human comprehension, which seems like a reasonable assessment. Your tongue would immediately swell to several times its normal size, making speaking impossible for weeks. When the swelling finally went down, you'd be left with a permanent hole and scar tissue that would affect your speech for the rest of your life. But here's the really clever part. You could still work. You could still do manual labor, still serve your lord, still contribute to society. You just couldn't clearly articulate any more inconvenient truth. It was precision punishment, disabling the specific body part that had caused the problem without destroying your overall economic value. Some variations included piercing the tongue and then leaving the iron spike in place permanently, creating a sort of medieval speech impediment that served as a constant reminder of your transgression. Others involved piercing multiple holes, creating a tongue that looked like a piece of Swiss cheese and functioned about as well. When everyone in your community had seen what happened to people who spoke out of turn, the result was a society where dangerous topics simply weren't discussed. People learned to communicate in code, if at all. Direct criticism of authority became unthinkable. Political discussions vanished from taverns and marketplaces. Even private conversations became guarded, because you never knew who might be listening or who might decide to report your words to the authorities. The genius of tongue punishment was that it created a feedback loop of silence. People who had been punished couldn't speak clearly enough to organize resistance. People who hadn't been punished were too terrified to risk speaking out, and the few brave souls who did speak up served as fresh examples of what happened to troublemaking. Medieval communities developed what we might now recognize as collective trauma responses. Entire towns would go quiet when authority figures passed through. Conversations would stop mid-sentence if the wrong person entered a room. People learned to communicate with glances, gestures, and carefully neutral expressions that revealed nothing of their actual thoughts. And the really insidious part was that this silence was often interpreted as consent. When peasants didn't complain about new taxes, lords assumed they were happy with the arrangement. When townspeople didn't object to new regulations, officials took it as approval. The absence of dissent was treated as evidence that the system was working perfectly. But tongue punishments were just the beginning of medieval society's war on free speech. Because while men who spoke out of turn faced tongue piercing, women who committed the same offense faced something much worse. Medieval misogyny had produced a special punishment designed specifically for women who had the audacity to have opinions and express them publicly. Are you ready to learn about one of history's most sexist torture devices? Because we're about to explore the charming world of the scold's bridle, a metal contraption designed to literally lock women's mouths shut while simultaneously humiliating them in the most public way possible. Remember when I asked you to appreciate your tongue? Well, now I want you to appreciate your freedom to open and close your mouth at will, because we're about to learn what happened to women who used that freedom a little too liberally for medieval society's taste. And trust me, it's going to make you very, very grateful for the 20. Are you a woman who has ever expressed an opinion in public? Have you ever disagreed with someone in authority? Have you ever engaged in what might be called gossip? You know, that thing humans do where they share information about their community. If you answered yes to any of these, congratulations. You would have been a prime candidate for one of history's most degrading punishments. How women were silenced forever. The scold's bridle was medieval society's answer to a problem they'd apparently been struggling with for centuries. Women who wouldn't shut up. Now, to be clear, when medieval sources talk about scolds and shrews and gossips, they weren't necessarily referring to women who were actually causing problems. They were often talking about women who dared to have opinions, who spoke up about injustices, who questioned authority, or who simply talked more than medieval men thought was appropriate. The device itself was a masterpiece of misogynistic engineering. Picture a metal cage designed to fit completely around a woman's head, with iron bands that locked at the back of the neck. The front of the cage featured a metal plate with holes that allowed the wearer to breathe, but made speaking clearly nearly impossible. And here's the really special part. Inside the cage was a metal tongue depressor, a flat iron piece that would press down on the tongue, making speech painful and difficult. But wait, it gets better. Some versions included metal spikes on the tongue depressor, not long enough to cause permanent damage, but sharp enough to pierce the tongue if the wearer tried too hard to speak. It was like having a medieval anti-talking device locked onto your head, complete with built-in punishment for attempted communication. The psychological torment was just as carefully designed as the physical discomfort. The bridle was deliberately humiliating. It made the wearer look like an animal, specifically like a horse with a bridle. The message was clear. Women who spoke out of turn were no better than beasts that needed to be controlled and led around by their superiors. And just to add insult to injury, Many bridles were decorated with humiliating engravings or attachments. Some had bells that would ring whenever the wearer moved her head, ensuring that everyone would notice her shame. Others had crude images or words carved into the metal, advertising the wearer's supposed crimes to anyone who looked at her. The fitting process was its own special kind of torture. The woman would be held down by assistants while the executioner or local official carefully measured her head and selected the appropriate bridle. The metal cage would be fitted around her skull, the tongue depressor positioned just right to maximize discomfort without preventing breathing, and then the whole contraption would be locked in place with a key that would be kept by the authority. Metal torture on your face. Now, let's really dig into what it was like to wear one of these contraptions, because the physical experience was designed to be as miserable as possible without actually killing the victim. Remember, dead women can't serve as examples to other women who might be tempted to express opinions. First, there was the weight. These devices were made of iron, and iron is heavy. Imagine wearing a metal helmet that presses down on your skull, neck and jaw for hours or days at a time. Your neck muscles would cramp, your shoulders would ache from the constant strain of supporting the extra weight. Your scalp would develop pressure sores where the metal bands rubbed against your skin. Then there was the constant pressure on your tongue. The metal depressor would press down continuously, making your tongue swell and become sore. Saliva would build up with nowhere to go, causing you to drool constantly. Another deliberately humiliating aspect of the punishment. The metal would taste like blood and rust, and after a few hours your entire mouth would feel like it was on fire. Eating and drinking became major challenges. Food had to be pushed through the holes in the front of the cage, and liquids had to be carefully poured to avoid choking. Many women lost significant weight during their time in the bridal, not just because eating was difficult, but because the constant stress and humiliation killed their appetite. Sleeping was nearly impossible. The metal cage made it impossible to lie comfortably on your side, and lying on your back meant the full weight of the device pressed down on your face and throat. Most women had to sleep sitting up, if they slept at all. After a few days, exhaustion would add to the physical misery, creating a feedback loop of suffering. And let's not forget the weather. Medieval Britain wasn't exactly known for its pleasant climate, and metal conducts temperature very efficient. On cold days, the bridle would become freezing cold, literally burning your skin with cold metal. On hot days it would heat up like an oven, creating what was essentially a metal greenhouse around your head. Rain would collect in the device and drip constantly into your eyes and mouth. Snow would accumulate on top, adding even more weight. But perhaps the worst part was the isolation. The bridle made normal human interaction impossible. You couldn't eat meals with your family. You couldn't participate in conversation. You couldn't comfort your children when they cried or sing them lullabies at bedtime. You became a silent, shameful presence in your own home, a living reminder of what happened to women who stepped out of line. Public humiliation as entertainment. Of course, the real purpose of the Scold's bridle wasn't just to punish individual women. It was to provide public entertainment while reinforcing social hierarchy. Women wearing bridles weren't hidden away in dungeons. They were paraded through the streets, displayed in market squares and forced to go about their daily business while wearing their shame for all to see. The public humiliation was carefully orchestrated. The authorities would often schedule the bridling ceremony to coincide with market days or religious festivals, ensuring maximum attendance. The victim would be led through the streets while town criers announced her crimes to anyone who hadn't already heard. Hear ye, Mary the miller's wife has been bridled for the crime of speaking ill of her betters. Let all women take note. Children would follow the bridled woman through the streets, pointing and laughing. Adults would shake their heads and mutter about the decline of proper feminine behavior. Other women would watch in terrified silence, knowing that they could be next if they weren't careful about their own words and behavior. The really cruel touch was that bridled women were often required to continue their normal activities while wearing the device. They still had to go to market to buy food for their families. They still had to attend church services. They still had to work in the fields or tend to household duties. But now they had to do all of this while wearing a metal cage that advertised their shame to the entire community. Market vendors would mock them, knowing they couldn't respond. Children would ask loudly why the lady was wearing the funny metal hat. Neighbors would whisper and point wherever they went. The punishment extended far beyond the physical discomfort. It was designed to destroy the victim's social standing and relationships permanently. And here's the really twisted part. The community was expected to participate in the humiliation. If you showed sympathy to a bridled woman, if you tried to help her or treated her with kindness, you could be accused of supporting her crimes. The safest response was to join in the mockery or at least maintain cold indifference. Some towns even had special ceremonies for removing the bridle, turning the end of the punishment into another public spectacle. The woman would be brought back to the town square, where officials would ceremoniously unlock the device while lecturing the crowd about the importance of women knowing their proper place. The removal itself was often painful. After days or weeks of wear, the metal would have rubbed the skin raw, and dried blood or pus might have sealed parts of the device to the victim's head. But even after the bridle was removed, the humiliation continued. Everyone in the community would remember what had happened. The woman's reputation would be permanently damaged. Her children might be teased about having a mother who had been bridled. Her husband might face questions about his ability to control his wife. The punishment created ripple effects that could last for generations. Medieval records show that some women became so depressed after being bridled that they never spoke publicly again. Others left their communities entirely, unable to bear the ongoing shame. A few tragically took their own lives rather than continue living with the humiliation. The psychological damage often lasted far longer than the physical wounds. And what crimes earned this horrific punishment? The records are enlightening and infuriating in equal measure. Women were bridled for nagging their husbands. They were bridled for gossiping. They were bridled for speaking disrespectfully to their betters. One particularly well-documented case from 1567 involved a woman named Agnes Mills, who was bridled for the crime of disturbing the peace with her clamorous tongue. She had complained publicly that the local lord was charging excessive rent while letting his properties fall into disrepair. She wore the bridle for 2 weeks, during which time her infant child died, possibly from malnutrition, since breastfeeding was nearly impossible with the device. But don't worry, we're not done exploring medieval creativity when it comes to punishment, because while the scold's bridle was specifically designed for mouthy women, medieval society had even more dramatic punishments for people accused of more serious crimes. Crimes like having knowledge of herbs, or owning a cat, or being a woman who lived alone and seemed too independent. Yes, we're about to enter the wonderful world of witchcraft accusations, where the punishment was literally being burned alive in front of cheering crowds. And let me tell you, medieval people had turned public executions into quite the art form. Do you know any women who live alone, who have cats, who know anything about cooking, gardening, or basic medicine, who are maybe a little eccentric or too intelligent for their own good, or just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? If you answered yes, congratulations. They all would have been prime candidates for medieval witchcraft accusations. When herbs made you a witch, let's paint a picture of how easy it was to become a suspected witch in medieval times. Meet Margaret the herbalist. Let's say she's a widowed woman in her 40s who lives on the edge of town with her 3 cats. She has a small garden where she grows medicinal herbs, and she's developed a reputation for being able to help with minor ailments. Stomach troubles? Margaret has a tea for that. Infected wound? She knows which plants can help prevent festering. Difficult childbirth? She's assisted at dozens of deliveries and knows techniques that can save both mother and child. Sounds helpful, right? Well, in medieval times, this made Margaret incredibly suspicious. See, according to medieval Christian theology, illness and suffering were sent by God as punishment for sin. If God wanted you to suffer, who was Margaret to interfere with divine will? And how could an uneducated woman possibly know things about healing that learned male physicians didn't know? The answer, obviously, was that she must be getting her knowledge from the devil. The accusation process was beautifully simple and virtually impossible to defend against. It usually started with something going wrong in the community: a crop failure, an unusually harsh winter, a series of miscarriages, or just a run of bad luck. Medieval people didn't believe in coincidences or random events. Everything happened for a reason, and that reason was usually either God's blessing or Satan's interference. Once people started looking for someone to blame, Margaret's lifestyle made her an obvious target. She lived alone. Suspicious. Why didn't she have a husband to control her? She had cats. Everyone knew cats were witches' familiars. She knew things about herbs and healing. Clearly supernatural knowledge. She was getting older, and maybe a bit more eccentric, obviously being corrupted by dark forces. And most damning of all, she was a woman with independence and knowledge. 2 things medieval society found absolutely terrifying in combination. The formal accusation could come from anywhere. Maybe a neighbor whose child had died despite Margaret's herbal remedies. Clearly she had cursed the child instead of helping. Maybe a local priest who was jealous of her popularity and influence. God's representatives shouldn't be overshadowed by herb-wielding widow. Maybe just someone who owed her money and saw an opportunity to eliminate the debt permanently. Once accused, Margaret would be arrested and subjected to what medieval authorities charmingly called questioning. This wasn't a gentle interrogation. We're talking about systematic torture designed to extract confessions. The logic was simple. Innocent people would maintain their innocence under any amount of suffering, while guilty people would eventually confess to save themselves from further pain. The fact that this logic was completely backwards didn't seem to bother anyone. The ceremony of flames. Now, assuming Margaret either confessed under torture or was found guilty despite maintaining her innocence, both were equally likely. We come to the execution phase, and medieval people had turned witch burning into quite the elaborate ceremony. The execution would be scheduled for a market day or religious festival to ensure maximum attendance. This wasn't just about killing Margaret, it was about providing entertainment, reinforcing religious orthodoxy, and reminding everyone what happened to people who stepped outside accepted social roles. The preparation alone was a form of psychological torture. Margaret would be kept in a dungeon for days or weeks before her execution, listening to the sounds of construction as workers built her pyre in the town square. She'd hear the hammering, the sawing, the delivery of wood and kindling. The smell of tar and oil would drift through her cell window as workers prepared the accelerants that would ensure a properly dramatic fire. On execution day, Margaret would be dragged from her cell and paraded through the streets she'd once walked freely. The procession would be led by religious officials carrying crosses and chanting prayers, followed by civil authorities. Then Margaret herself, often in a cart since many victims were too weak from torture and imprisonment to walk. And finally a crowd of spectators who had turned out for the show. The pyre itself was a carefully engineered structure. It wasn't just a pile of wood. It was designed for maximum visual impact and controlled burning. The platform would be raised high enough for everyone to see, with a wooden post at the center where Margaret would be chained. The wood would be arranged in layers of different sizes and types, with kindling and accelerants placed strategically to ensure the fire would catch quickly and burn evenly. Margaret would be tied to the post with chains rather than rope. Rope burns through too quickly and might allow escape. If the authorities were feeling merciful, they might allow her to have a bag of gunpowder tied around her neck, which would explode when the flames reached it and end her suffering quickly. More often, no such mercy was provided. Then came the lighting ceremony. Usually a religious official would have the honor of setting the fire, often while delivering a sermon about the dangers of consorting with Satan and the importance of maintaining proper Christian behavior. The crowd would watch in fascination as the flames caught the kindling, spread to the larger wood, and began to climb toward the victim. Last words that broke hearts. The accounts of what actually happened during these executions are simultaneously heartbreaking and terrifying. Many victims spent their final moments not cursing their accusers or calling upon Satan, as their tormentors expected, but praying to God and proclaiming their innocence. They'd cry out for their children, call for their deceased husbands, or simply scream in agony as the flames consumed. The physical process of being burned alive is almost too horrible to describe, but it's important to understand what these people endured. Fire doesn't kill quickly or cleanly. First, the flames would singe the hair and clothing. Then they'd begin to burn the skin, causing blisters and intense pain. The victim would often lose consciousness from smoke inhalation before the flames actually killed them, but not always. Sometimes the wind would blow the smoke away, keeping them conscious for the entire ordeal. The crowd's reaction varied depending on the community and the specific case. Sometimes they'd cheer and celebrate, convinced they were watching divine justice in action. Other times they'd watch in horrified silence, especially if the victim was someone they'd known and liked. Occasionally witnesses would later report that they'd begun to doubt the victim's guilt as they watched an apparently innocent person die in agony. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of these executions was how they affected the victim's family. Children would watch their mothers burn alive, branded forever as the offspring of witches. Husbands and fathers were often forced to publicly denounce their wives and daughters to avoid being accused themselves. Entire family lines could be destroyed by a single accusation. The psychological impact on the community was enormous. These executions didn't just kill individuals, they terrorized entire populations into conformity. Women learned to avoid anything that might make them seem suspicious. They got rid of cats, destroyed herb gardens, avoided helping with medical problems, and tried to make themselves as invisible and conventional as possible. And here's the really twisted part. The system was designed to perpetuate itself. Every execution created more fear, which led to more accusations, which led to more executions. Communities became caught in cycles of paranoia and violence that could last for decades.
But witch burning was just one type of public execution that medieval people had perfected, because while burning was reserved for heretics and witches, there were other crimes that called for different but equally dramatic punishments. Capital crimes like murder, treason, or theft of valuable items earned you a date with the executioner's axe, and medieval headsmen had their own special techniques for making sure the show was worth watching.
Have you ever tried to chop wood? You know how sometimes the axe bounces off, or gets stuck halfway through, or hits the wood at the wrong angle and goes flying? Well, now imagine that the wood is a human neck. The axe might be dull, and there's a crowd of people watching who will be very disappointed if the show isn't entertaining enough. Starting to see the problem? The axe that never missed, or did it? Let's meet your executioner. We'll call him Big Tom the Head Remover. Now, you might think that medieval societies would want their executioners to be highly trained professionals with years of experience and perfectly maintained equipment. You would be adorably wrong. Most executioners learn their trade through apprenticeship, usually from a family member who was already in the business. It wasn't exactly a profession that attracted the best and brightest of medieval society. The pay was irregular, the social status was terrible, even peasants looked down on executioners, and the job requirements included being comfortable with chopping off the heads of people you might have grown up with. Big Tom's axe was probably a modified woodcutting tool, because specialized execution equipment was expensive and most towns couldn't afford to maintain it. The blade might be sharp if Tom had remembered to maintain it recently, but given that executions were relatively rare events and Tom probably had other jobs to pay the bills, maintenance wasn't always a top priority. The execution block, that wooden platform where you'd rest your neck, was usually just a sturdy piece of wood that had been used for previous execution. By the time it was your turn, it would be stained with the blood of everyone who'd been executed before you, and probably carved with grooves from previous axe strikes that had missed their mark and hit the wood instead. Now here's where things get really interesting from a technical perspective. Beheading a human being with a single clean strike requires precise aim, significant strength, and a very sharp blade hitting at exactly the right angle. The human neck contains vertebrae, major blood vessels, muscle, and sinew. It's not exactly easy to cut through, especially when you're swinging an axe while standing in front of a crowd of people who are critiquing your performance. Professional executioners in major cities might have developed real skill over years of practice, but in smaller towns and villages, executions were often carried out by whoever happened to be available, sometimes the local blacksmith, sometimes a soldier, sometimes just a volunteer from the crowd who claimed to have experience with axing. The result was that one clean strike beheadings were more the exception than the rule. Medieval records are full of accounts of executioners requiring multiple swings to complete the job. 2 or 3 attempts were common, 5 or 6 attempts were not unheard of, and in truly unfortunate cases, the executioner might hack away at the victim's neck for several minutes before finally managing to separate head from body. The executioner's secret fears. Now let's talk about what this experience was like from Big Tom's perspective, because the psychological pressure on executioners was enormous. Imagine having to perform a precise, irreversible task in front of hundreds of people who are expecting entertainment and will judge your performance harshly if you mess it up. If Big Tom succeeded with one clean strike, the crowd would cheer and he'd be praised for his skill. But if he needed multiple attempts, especially if the victim remained conscious and screaming through several botched strikes, the crowd might turn ugly. They'd boo, throw things, and make it very clear that they felt cheated out of proper entertainment. This pressure often made executioners more nervous, which made them more likely to make mistakes, which created a vicious cycle of performance anxiety. Some executioners developed drinking problems to cope with the stress. Others had nervous breakdowns and abandoned the profession entirely. A few became so obsessed with achieving the perfect execution that they practiced constantly on animals, logs, and in some documented cases, corpses stolen from graveyards. The social isolation was another major problem. Executioners and their families were often shunned by their community. Children wouldn't play with the executioner's children. Merchants might refuse to serve them. They lived in a strange social limbo, necessary for society's functioning but despised by the very people they served. Many executioners dealt with this isolation by developing a gallows humor, literally about their work. They'd give nicknames to their axes, develop elaborate pre-execution rituals, and sometimes even joke with their victims to lighten the mood. This wasn't cruelty, it was a psychological defense mechanism to help them cope with repeatedly killing people in public. But the technical challenges were just as stressful as the social ones. The human neck is positioned at an awkward angle when someone is kneeling at an execution. The executioner has to swing downward at a precise angle while accounting for the height difference, the victim's posture, and their own stance. Too steep an angle, and the axe might bounce off the skull. Too shallow, and it might just create a horrible wound without completing the job. Weather conditions could make the job even more difficult. Rain made handles slippery and footing treacherous. Snow could hide the exact position of the block. Wind could affect the accuracy of the swing. Hot weather made heavy armor and clothing uncomfortable, which could affect performance. Executioners had to be prepared for all conditions while maintaining their accuracy under pressure. Entertainment for the whole family. Despite all these technical challenges, public beheadings remained one of medieval society's most popular forms of entertainment. And when I say entertainment, I mean it in the most literal sense. Families would pack picnic lunches, bring their children, and make a day of watching people get their heads chopped off. The atmosphere at a typical execution was more like a festival than a solemn legal proceeding. Vendors would set up stalls selling food, drink, and souvenirs. Children would run around playing games while their parents saved spots with good views of the scaffold. Musicians sometimes performed while the crowd waited for the main event to begin. The social dynamics were fascinating and horrible in equal measure. Different social classes would arrange themselves in a rough hierarchy around the execution site. Nobles got the best viewing positions, followed by wealthy merchants, then craftsmen, and finally peasants who had to watch from whatever spots they could find. The crowd participation was intense. They'd cheer when the condemned person was brought out, evaluate their appearance and demeanor, and offer commentary throughout the proceedings. He doesn't look repentant enough. She's not crying sufficiently. I hope the executioner's been practiced. The victim became a performer in an involuntary play, judged on how well they played their role as a condemned criminal. When the actual beheading began, the crowd's attention would become laser-focused. Everyone would try to get the best possible view of the moment when the axe fell. If it was a clean execution, they'd cheer. If it required multiple attempts, they'd groan, boo, or sometimes even demand a refund from, well, nobody, since executions were free, but they'd complain loudly about the poor quality of the entertainment. The aftermath was just as much of a spectacle as the execution itself. The severed head would often be held up for the crowd to see, sometimes with the executioner shouting traditional phrases like "Behold the head of a traitor." The crowd would cheer, children would point and ask questions, and people would push forward to get a better look at the gory details. Sometimes the heads would be preserved and displayed on spikes as ongoing entertainment and warning to others. The bodies might be left on display for days or weeks, depending on the crime and the message the authorities wanted to send. These displays became tourist attractions of sorts. People would make special trips to see famous criminals remain. But here's what really gets me about medieval public executions. They weren't just tolerated by society, they were considered essential for maintaining moral order. People genuinely believed that watching criminals die horrible deaths would teach their children important lessons about right and wrong. Parents would point to severed heads and say, "See what happens to people who don't follow the rule." The educational value was supposedly reinforced by the ritual aspects of the executions. Religious officials would deliver sermons about sin and punishment. The condemned would sometimes be encouraged to confess their crimes and warn others not to follow their path. The entire spectacle was framed as a moral lesson played out in blood and screams. And you know what, from a social control perspective, it probably worked. When everyone in your community had witnessed the consequences of serious crimes, people tended to be very careful about their behavior. The memory of watching someone's head get chopped off in front of their neighbors was the kind of deterrent that stuck with you for life. But beheading was far from the only method of execution available to medieval justice system. In fact, for certain types of crimes, authorities had developed even more creative and terrifying punishments. For instance, did you know that medieval people had perfected the art of determining guilt through trial by ordeal? Methods that basically boiled down to let's torture you and see if God saves you. Can you swim? Most people today learn to swim as children, so probably yes. Well, in medieval times, swimming was actually considered somewhat suspicious. The reasoning was beautifully simple. If you could swim, you might be able to survive trial by water, even if you were guilty, which would interfere with God's judgment. So being able to swim was actually evidence that you might be planning to cheat on your trial. Medieval logic at its finest. Sink and you're innocent, but dead. Let's walk through exactly how trial by water worked, because the process was as carefully designed as it was completely insane. The basic principle was that water, being pure and blessed by God, would reject evil. So if you were innocent, the water would accept you, meaning you'd sink. And if you were guilty, the water would reject you, meaning you'd float. Now, you've probably already spotted the rather glaring flaw in this system. If you sink, you prove your innocence, but also probably drown. If you float, you prove your guilt and face execution. It's like a medieval version of a rigged game show where both answers are wrong and the prize is death. But medieval authorities had thought this through. The idea was that if you were truly innocent, God would perform a miracle to save you from drowning. Maybe an angel would appear, or you'd suddenly develop the ability to breathe underwater, or the water would mysteriously become shallow. The fact that such miracles were remarkably rare didn't seem to shake anyone's faith in the system. The actual procedure was elaborate and ritualized. First, you'd be brought to a body of water, usually a river or large pond that had been blessed by a priest for the occasion. The entire community would gather to witness God's judgment, because this wasn't just a trial, it was a religious ceremony. You'd be stripped to ensure you weren't hiding anything that might affect your buoyancy. Then your hands and feet would be bound, not tightly enough to guarantee drowning, but securely enough to prevent swimming. The binding was usually done with blessed rope that had been prayed over, because if you're going to tie someone up and throw them in a river, you might as well make it holy. A priest would say prayers over you and the water, asking God to reveal the truth through his divine judgment. Sometimes holy relics would be present to increase the spiritual power of the proceedings. The crowd would join in prayers and hymns, creating a festive religious atmosphere around what was essentially sanctified attempted murder. Then came the moment of truth. You'd be lowered into the water, usually with a rope tied around your waist so they could pull you out quickly if you sank, proving innocence, or watch you float while they prepared your execution, proving guilt. Float and face the gallows. Now here's where the medieval understanding of physics becomes truly entertaining. The authorities actually believed they could determine guilt or innocence based on whether someone floated or sank in water. They had elaborate theories about how sin affected body density and how God would manipulate natural laws to reveal the truth. In reality, whether someone floats or sinks depends on factors like body composition, lung capacity, water temperature, and how the person is positioned in the water. None of these have anything to do with moral guilt. But medieval people weren't exactly big on empirical observation when it came to matters of justice. If you were unlucky enough to float, which happened more often than sinking, since most people will naturally float if they're not struggling frantically, the crowd would gasp in horror at this clear evidence of your guilt. The priest would declare that God had spoken, and you'd be hauled out of the water to face whatever punishment had been predetermined for your crime. The really twisted part was that floating was often interpreted as not just evidence of guilt, but evidence of particularly heinous guilt. The reasoning was that you had to be really truly evil for the pure water to reject you so completely. This meant that people who floated often faced harsher punishments than those who had been convicted through normal means. If you sank, there would be a scramble to pull you out before you drowned, because drowning an innocent person would be murder. Sometimes they succeeded in reviving victims who had sunk, which was declared a miracle and proof of the system's divine origin. Sometimes they didn't, which was explained as God calling the innocent person home to heaven rather than forcing them to continue living in a sinful world. The timing of when to pull someone out was left to the judgment of the officials overseeing the trial. Too quick and critics might claim the trial was rigged in favor of innocence. Too slow and you'd have a dead innocent person on your hands, which was awkward from both legal and theological perspective. The impossible choice. From the victim's perspective, trial by water presented an absolutely impossible situation. Your survival strategy had to account for the fact that both possible outcomes, floating and sinking, were potentially fatal, just in different ways. If you tried to float deliberately to get pulled out quickly, you'd be declared guilty and executed. If you tried to sink by exhaling all your air and not struggling, you'd be declared innocent but might drown before they could rescue. If you struggled naturally, you'd probably float due to the air in your lungs and be declared guilty. Some accused people tried to game the system by teaching themselves to control their breathing, or by finding ways to make themselves sick. But these attempts often backfired. The authorities were looking for natural responses that would reveal God's judgment, and any evidence that you were trying to manipulate the outcome could be seen as proof of guilt in itself. The psychological torture of the waiting period was often worse than the trial itself. You'd be held in custody for days or weeks while preparations were made, during which time you'd have plenty of opportunity to contemplate the fact that you were about to be thrown into water while tied up, and that both possible outcomes of this trial could result in your death. Family members and friends were often forced to watch the proceedings, adding emotional torture to physical terror. Imagine having to watch your spouse or parent or child being lowered into a river while tied up, knowing that you were about to find out whether they lived or died based on the arbitrary physics of human buoyancy. The community pressure was enormous too. If you proclaimed your innocence too loudly, you might be accused of lacking faith in God's judgment. If you seemed too resigned to your fate, you might be seen as admitting guilt. If you appeared too confident, you might be suspected of planning to cheat somehow. There was no right way to behave when facing trial by water.
Medieval records show that some people became so terrified by the prospect of trial by water that they confessed to crimes they hadn't committed rather than face the ordeal. Others became convinced that they must actually be guilty of something, since God wouldn't allow innocent people to be subjected to such trials. The psychological impact extended far beyond the actual procedure. But trial by water was just one form of the medieval justice system's approach to letting God determine guilt or innocence through physical ordeals. There was also trial by fire, where the logic was equally impeccable. If you could carry a red-hot iron bar without being seriously injured, clearly God was protecting you because you were innocent. If you were badly burned, well, obviously you were guilty and deserved to suffer.
Have you ever accidentally touched a hot stove? You know that immediate searing pain that makes you jerk your hand away instinctively? Well, imagine being forced to grab something much hotter than a stove burner, hold onto it, and walk several steps while a crowd of people watches to see if God will miraculously prevent your flesh from burning. Fun times, trial boiling water hand test. Trial by fire came in several equally charming varieties, but let's start with one of the most popular, the boiling water ordeal. This was like trial by water's sadistic cousin. Instead of throwing you in water to see if you float, they'd make you plunge your hand into boiling water and retrieve an object from the bottom. The setup was elaborate and ritualized, because medieval people loved their ceremonies, even when those ceremonies involved deliberately scolding people. A large cauldron would be set up in the town square and filled with water. Priests would bless the water while it was being heated, asking God to use it as an instrument of his divine justice. Sometimes, holy relics would be dipped into the water to increase its spiritual potency. The water would be heated until it was at a full, rolling boil, not just warm, not just hot, but actually bubbling with steam rising from the surface. Into this cauldron, they'd drop a small object, usually a stone or a piece of metal, that you'd be required to retrieve with your bare hand. Now, here's where medieval logic really shines. If you were innocent, God would protect you from harm, and your hand would emerge from the boiling water unburned. If you were guilty, the boiling water would burn your flesh as nature intended, proving your guilt through the severity of your injuries. The actual process was as horrifying as you'd expect. You'd be brought before the cauldron while the crowd gathered to witness God's judgment. A priest would say final prayers over you and the water. Then, with everyone watching, you'd be required to plunge your hand into the boiling water, grope around on the bottom for the object, grab it, and pull it out. The pain was described by witnesses as beyond human endurance. The boiling water would immediately begin cooking your flesh, causing blisters to form within seconds. The natural human reflex would be to jerk your hand away immediately. But if you did that, you'd be accused of lacking faith in God's protection, and automatically declared guilty. So you had to force yourself to keep your hand in the boiling water long enough to find and retrieve the object, fighting every instinct your body had, while your flesh was literally being cooked. Many people passed out from the pain before completing the ordeal, which was usually interpreted as evidence of guilt. After all, innocent people protected by God shouldn't be unable to handle his test. Waiting for God's verdict. But here's the really diabolical part. The trial wasn't over when you pulled your hand out of the boiling water. That was just the beginning. The real judgment came during the healing process. After the ordeal, your hand would be bandaged and sealed, usually with wax and blessed cloth, to prevent you from treating the burns or interfering with the healing process. You'd then be kept under guard for 3 days while the community waited to see how your burns healed. The logic was that if you were innocent, God would heal your burns miraculously, leaving little or no scarring. If you were guilty, the burns would heal slowly and leave permanent damage, proving that God had withdrawn his protection from your sinful flesh. These 3 days of waiting were psychological torture. You'd sit in a cell with your hand throbbing in agony, knowing that your life depended on how quickly your body could recover from severe burn. You'd pray constantly, not just for healing but for the miracle that would prove your innocence to your community. Family members would often maintain vigils outside the jail, praying for divine intervention. The entire community would be on edge, waiting to see what God's verdict would be. Some people placed bets on the outcome, because apparently turning divine judgment into a gambling opportunity seemed perfectly reasonable to medieval minds. On the 3rd day there would be another public ceremony for the unwrapping. The bandages would be removed in front of witnesses, usually including priests, local officials, and a crowd of curious onlookers. Everyone would examine your hand to determine the extent of healing.
Here's where things get really interesting from a medical perspective. Burns from boiling water are severe third-degree injuries that take weeks or months to heal properly under the best of circumstances. The idea that they could heal significantly in just 3 days is medically impossible. But medieval people didn't have modern understanding of burn treatment or healing processes. What they did have was a remarkable ability to interpret evidence to match their preconception. If your burns looked slightly less terrible than expected, that could be declared miraculous healing, proving innocence. If they looked exactly as terrible as severe burns should look after 3 days, that was evidence of guilt. The authorities had enormous discretion in determining what constituted miraculous healing versus normal healing. Sometimes the outcome was predetermined by political consideration. If you were a popular community member or someone the authorities preferred not to execute, your healing might be interpreted more generously. If you were already unpopular or if your death would be convenient for local politics, the standards for miraculous healing might be set impossibly high. Miracle or certain death. The hot iron ordeal was even more dramatic than the boiling water test. Instead of plunging your hand into water, you'd be required to carry a piece of red-hot iron for a specific distance, usually 9 steps, because 9 was considered a holy number. The iron would be heated in a forge until it glowed bright red or orange. We're talking about metal heated to temperatures of 100–1500 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause instantaneous severe burns to human flesh. The iron would be shaped like a bar with a handle area, but even the handle would be hot enough to cause serious injury. You'd be required to pick up this glowing piece of metal with your bare hands and carry it 9 steps while the crowd counted along. 1, 2, 3. Each step would be agony as the superheated metal burned deeper into your palms and fingers. The smell of your own flesh burning would fill your nostrils, but you had to complete all 9 steps or the trial would be invalid and you'd automatically be declared guilty. Some victims collapsed before completing the walk. Others dropped the iron partway through, either from pain or because their burned flesh simply couldn't maintain a grip on the metal. These failures were interpreted as lack of faith or evidence of guilt. After all, if God wanted to protect you, He would give you the strength to complete His test. The truly horrifying accounts describe people who did manage to complete the 9 steps. Their hands would be so severely burned that the flesh would be black and charred. Some lost fingers entirely when the superheated metal burned through tendons and bone. Yet they still had to wait 3 days to see if their injuries would heal miraculously enough to prove their innocence. Medieval records include accounts of people whose hands were so damaged by the hot iron ordeal that they never regained full use of them, even if they were declared innocent. The punishment in effect was administered regardless of the verdict. The only question was whether the crippling injury came with a death sentence attached. But here's what really gets me about these ordeals. They were considered the height of fairness and divine justice. Medieval people genuinely believed that God would intervene to protect innocent people from harm. When innocent people were horribly burned anyway, it was explained as mysterious divine will that mere humans couldn't understand. The psychological impact on communities was enormous. Everyone knew someone who had undergone trial by fire. Everyone had seen the results. The burns, the scars, the permanent disabilities. Children grew up watching adults get systematically tortured in the name of justice, and they learned to accept this as normal and necessary. Some people became so terrified of trial by fire that they fled their communities when accused rather than face the ordeal. Others confessed to crimes they hadn't committed, preferring execution to the certainty of severe burns followed by possible execution. The mere threat of trial by fire was often enough to extract confessions or admissions of guilt. And you know what the really twisted part was? These ordeals were often presented as merciful alternatives to other forms of trial. Instead of being judged by human authorities who might be biased or corrupt, you got to have your case decided directly by God Himself through His willingness to protect you from physical harm. It was marketed as the ultimate in fair and impartial justice. The Church fully supported these practices because they reinforced religious authority and provided dramatic demonstrations of divine power. Every trial by fire was a public affirmation that God was actively involved in human affairs, watching over the innocent and punishing the guilty. The fact that the results seemed random didn't shake anyone's faith. It just proved that God's ways were mysterious and beyond human understanding. But trial by ordeal was just the tip of the iceberg when it came to medieval torture and punishment. Because while these public spectacles were designed to determine guilt or innocence, medieval authorities had developed an entire arsenal of torture devices specifically designed for extracting confessions from people who were already assumed to be guilty.
Have you ever been to a chiropractor? You know how they make those little adjustments to your spine that sometimes hurt? but ultimately make you feel better. Well, medieval torture masters had a device that did something similar to your spine. Except, instead of making small helpful adjustments, it stretched your entire body until your joints separated and your bones dislocated. Fun times ahead. The rack's bone-breaking symphony. Let's start with the crown jewel of medieval torture devices, the rack. This wasn't some crude contraption thrown together by sadistic amateurs. It was a precisely engineered machine designed to stretch the human body beyond its natural limits, while keeping the victim alive and conscious throughout the process. Picture a wooden frame about the size of a modern bed, but instead of a comfortable mattress, it had a flat wooden platform with rollers at each end. Your wrists would be chained to one roller, your ankles to the other, and then the torture master would begin turning cranks that slowly pulled the rollers apart, stretching your body like a piece of taffy. The genius of the rack was in its gradual operation. This wasn't about causing sudden, shocking pain. It was about slowly increasing pressure over time, allowing the torturer to control exactly how much suffering to inflict. Each turn of the crank would stretch your joints a little further, gradually moving from discomfort to pain to agony to injury. At first you'd feel a strange pulling sensation as your body was stretched slightly beyond its normal position. This might actually feel good initially, like a full body stretch after sitting too long. The torturer would often stop at this point and ask if you were ready to confess, giving you one last chance to avoid what was coming next. If you refused to confess, or if you genuinely didn't know what they wanted you to confess to, the stretching would continue. The pulling sensation would become uncomfortable, then painful as your joints were stretched beyond their normal range of motion. Your shoulders, hips, knees and ankles would begin to ache as ligaments and tendons were pulled taut. But the rack was just getting started. As the cranking continued, your joints would begin to separate slightly. This is where the real agony began. Not just pain, but the horrifying sensation of your body literally being pulled apart. Your shoulder joints would start to dislocate, creating waves of excruciating pain that shot down your arms and through your chest. The sounds were almost as horrible as the pain. Witnesses described hearing the victim's joints popping and clicking as they separated, accompanied by screams that could be heard throughout the castle or prison. The torturer would often pause between turns of the crank, both to let the pain intensify and to ask again if the victim was ready to confess. Screams that echoed for miles. Now here's where the psychological aspect of torture becomes truly diabolical. The rack wasn't just about physical pain. It was about creating terror and breaking the victim's will to resist. The torture chamber was designed to amplify fear and despair in every possible way. First, there was the setting. Torture chambers were typically located in the deepest parts of castles or prisons, far enough underground that screams wouldn't disturb the people above, but close enough that rumors of what happened there would spread throughout the community. The rooms were deliberately dark, damp, and oppressive, lit only by flickering torches that cast dancing shadows on stone walls. The chambers would contain multiple torture devices, not just the rack. Victims would be brought in and forced to look at the various instruments that might be used on them. The Iron Maiden with its interior spikes, the thumb screws designed to crush fingers, the branding irons heating and brazier. This preview of potential suffering was intended to break down resistance before the actual torture even began. The torture master himself was a crucial part of the psychological warfare. These weren't wild-eyed maniacs who enjoyed causing pain. They were skilled professionals who understood human psychology and knew how to manipulate fear and hope to extract information. They would often speak calmly and reasonably, explaining exactly what each device would do to the victim's body and offering repeated opportunities to confess and end the suffering. "You see this crank?" the torturer might say conversationally while gesturing to the rack. Each turn stretches you a little more. Most people start begging to confess after about 10 turns, when their shoulders begin to separate, but some stubborn ones last all the way to 20 turns, when their arms actually pull out of their sockets entirely. How many turns do you think you'll last? This clinical, almost friendly approach was more terrifying than ranting and screaming would have been. It made the torture seem inevitable and methodical rather than passionate and temporary. Victims knew they were dealing with someone who did this regularly, professionally, and would continue doing it until they got what they wanted. The pacing was carefully calculated too. Torture sessions could last for hours, with breaks built in to let pain intensify and to give victims time to contemplate confess. Sometimes victims would be returned to their cells overnight and brought back the next day, spending the intervening hours in terror about what fresh agonies awaited them. The sound design was also deliberate. Torture chambers were often built with acoustic properties that amplified screams,
both to intimidate the current victim and to serve as a warning to other prisoners who might hear the sounds echoing through the corridor. Nothing broke down resistance quite like listening to someone else being tortured and knowing that your turn was coming next. The torturer's daily routine. Now let's talk about the people who actually operated these devices, because the medieval torture profession was more complex and organized than you might expect. These weren't random sadists who wandered into the job. They were skilled craftsmen who had learned their trade through apprenticeship and took professional pride in their work. Master torturers were well-paid specialists who understood human anatomy, psychology, and the precise application of pain. They knew exactly how much pressure different joints could withstand before permanent damage occurred. They understood which types of pain were most effective for breaking different personality types. They could keep someone conscious and responsive through hours of agony without letting them escape into unconsciousness or death. The apprenticeship system meant that torture techniques were passed down through generations, constantly refined and improved. Master torturers would teach apprentices not just how to operate the devices, but how to read victims' responses, how to calibrate pain levels, and how to maintain equipment for maximum effectiveness. And yes, they maintained their equipment meticulously. A rack with loose chains or squeaky rollers wasn't just unprofessional, it was less effective. The psychological impact depended partly on the torture devices appearing well maintained and ready to use. Rusty, broken equipment suggested incompetence, while gleaming, well-oiled machines suggested terrible competence. Many torture masters kept detailed records of their sessions. They'd note which techniques worked best on different types of victims, how long various people lasted before confessing, and what methods produced the most useful information. This wasn't sadistic record keeping, it was professional development, constantly improving their craft through careful observation and experimentation. The working conditions were actually quite good by medieval standards. Torture masters were well fed, well housed, and well paid. They often had assistants to help with the heavy work and scribes to record confessions. Some even had medical knowledge to help keep victims alive through extended torture sessions. After all, dead people can't provide information or serve as warnings to others. But the job had significant drawbacks. The social isolation was extreme, even in a society that accepted torture as necessary. People who actually performed it were often feared and avoided. Torture masters and their families lived apart from normal communities, creating dynasties of professional pain inflictors who intermarried and passed their skills down through bloodlines. The psychological toll was also enormous. While some torture masters may have been natural sadists who enjoyed their work, many others showed signs of what we'd now recognize as trauma responses. Alcoholism was common in the profession. Some developed elaborate rituals and superstitions to cope with their daily exposure to human suffering. Others became obsessively religious, apparently trying to balance their professional activities with spiritual practices. And despite their professional competence, torture masters lived with constant anxiety about their own futures. They knew secrets that could be dangerous to powerful people. They had intimate knowledge of brutal practices that might someday be used against them. Many lived in fear that political changes might make them convenient scapegoats for the very tortures they'd been ordered to perform. The equipment maintenance alone was a full-time job. Keeping metal devices from rusting in damp dungeon conditions required constant care. Wooden components needed regular replacement as they wore out or became contaminated with blood and other bodily fluids. The torture chamber had to be cleaned between sessions, not for humanitarian reasons, but because accumulated gore might interfere with the psychological impact on new victims. But the rack was just one instrument in a well-stocked torture chamber. Medieval ingenuity had produced dozens of specialized devices, each designed to cause specific types of suffering while extracting information. And beyond the torture chambers lay an even darker world. The castle dungeons, where prisoners who had survived torture were kept indefinitely, often in conditions that made the torture sessions seem merciful by comparison.
What's the longest you've ever been alone? A few hours? A day? Maybe a weekend when you were sick and couldn't leave the house? Well, prepare to appreciate human contact like never before, because we're about to learn what it was like to spend months or years in solitary confinement in a medieval dungeon, where the only sounds you'd hear were your own breathing and the scrabbling of rodents in the walls. Darkness that consumed souls. Medieval castle dungeons weren't just prisons. They were carefully designed instruments of psychological torture that broke down human sanity through systematic sensory deprivation and social isolation. The word dungeon itself comes from the French donjon, originally meaning the central keep of a castle, but it evolved to mean the underground cells where prisoners were kept in conditions that barely qualified as human survival. Let's paint a picture of your new home. Assuming you've been unfortunate enough to survive your torture session and earn a long-term stay in medieval accommodation, your cell would typically be carved directly into the bedrock beneath the castle, accessible only through a narrow stone staircase that spiraled down into darkness. The walls would be solid stone, often still bearing chisel marks from the masons who had carved them, with no windows and only a single small opening near the ceiling for minimal air circulation. The dimensions were deliberately claustrophobic, usually about 6 feet by 8 feet, with a ceiling low enough that most adults couldn't stand upright. This wasn't due to construction limitations, it was an intentional design choice. Medieval architects understood that cramped spaces increased psychological distress and made prisoners feel more helpless and animal-like. The only light came from whatever filtered down through the stairwell from above, which meant that during most of the day, your world would be in complete darkness. Not the kind of darkness you experience in a modern bedroom with blackout curtains. We're talking about absolute total darkness where you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Your eyes would adjust somewhat over time, but you'd still live in a world of shadows and shapes rather than clear vision. The temperature was constantly cold and damp. Stone is an excellent conductor of heat, which means it would leach warmth from your body continuously. The underground location meant that even during summer your cell would remain chilly and humid. In winter the cold would be so intense that prisoners often developed frostbite on their fingers and toes, and some froze to death entirely. The floor would be bare stone, often covered with a thin layer of straw that was changed infrequently if at all. This straw would become moldy and rotten over time, creating a breeding ground for bacteria and parasites. You'd sleep on this filthy bedding, eat on it and use one corner as a toilet, because medieval dungeons didn't come with bathroom facilities. Your furniture consisted of whatever you could create from your environment. Maybe a flat stone to sit on, maybe some straw piled into a makeshift pillow. If you were very lucky, you might have chains attached to the wall that you could lean against, though these were more commonly used to restrain prisoners than for their comfort. Rats as your only companions. The isolation was the most psychologically devastating aspect of dungeon life. Humans are social creatures who need interaction with others to maintain mental health, and medieval dungeons were designed to provide the absolute minimum human contact necessary to keep prisoners alive. Your only regular visitor would be the jailer, who might appear once a day, or less frequently, to deliver food and water. These interactions would be brief and minimal. The jailer wasn't there to chat or provide companionship. He was there to ensure you didn't die before the authorities were finished with you. Most jailers were specifically instructed to avoid forming any kind of relationship with prisoners, as this might interfere with their effectiveness as deterrents. Food delivery was a particularly grim affair. Your meal would typically be lowered down through a slot in the door, or through the ceiling opening, often in a bucket or bowl that you'd be expected to return when empty. The food itself was designed to keep you alive rather than nourished. Usually a thin gruel made from whatever scraps were available, sometimes supplemented with bread that was already moldy when it reached you. Water was equally precious and carefully rationed. You might receive enough for basic hydration but not enough for washing or cleaning. Over time you'd become filthy beyond description, covered in your own waste and whatever grime accumulated in your cell. The smell would become overwhelming, but you'd gradually lose awareness of it as your senses adapted to your environment. In this world of near-complete isolation, rats became genuinely important companions. These weren't the occasional mouse you might see in a modern house. Medieval dungeons were home to thriving populations of large, bold rats that had grown fat on whatever food prisoners dropped or left unguarded. They'd often outnumber human prisoners by hundreds to one. At first you'd probably be terrified of the rats. They'd steal your food, run across your body while you tried to sleep, and their red eyes gleaming in the darkness would be genuinely frightening. But over time, many prisoners developed almost friendship-like relationships with their rodent cellmates. The rats provided something to watch, something to interact with, and proof that life could survive in these horrible conditions. Some prisoners learned to save scraps of food to feed particular rats, essentially keeping them as pets. Others developed elaborate games involving the rats' behavior pattern. A few prisoners reported talking to rats as if they were human companions, having long conversations with creatures that couldn't respond but at least provided the illusion of social interaction. The rats also served as an early warning system for changes in the dungeon routine. They'd react to footsteps in the corridors before prisoners could hear them, potentially giving advance notice that the jailer or torture master was approaching. In a world where any variation in routine might mean the difference between life and death, this information was genuinely valuable.
The forgotten prisoners. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect of medieval dungeons was how easy it was for prisoners to simply be forgotten. Record keeping was primitive, and the people responsible for maintaining prisoner lists often had other duties that took priority. If the person who ordered your imprisonment died, moved away, or simply lost interest in your case, you might find yourself abandoned in your cell indefinitely. This wasn't uncommon. Castle archives contain records of prisoners who were discovered years or decades after their original imprisonment, often found as skeletons still chained to dungeon walls. Some had apparently been forgotten so completely that no one could remember who they were or why they'd been imprisoned in the first place. The psychological impact of this uncertainty was devastating. You'd never know if your imprisonment had a definite end date or if you were destined to die in your cell. Every day that passed without release added to the possibility that you'd been forgotten entirely. The hope that kept you sane could gradually transform into despair that destroyed your will to live. Communication between prisoners was often impossible due to the thick stone walls and the layout of dungeon complex. You might hear occasional sounds that suggested other human presence. Coughing, crying, screaming. But you'd rarely know if these sounds came from other prisoners, guards, or people in other parts of the castle. The acoustic properties of stone corridors could carry sounds from great distances, making it impossible to judge how close or far other people might be. Some prisoners developed elaborate systems for trying to communicate through walls, scratching patterns in stone, tapping codes, or leaving messages in areas where other prisoners might find them. But most of these efforts were unsuccessful, and the failure to make contact with other humans only increased the sense of isolation and abandonment. The gradual deterioration of mental health was predictable and systematic. After weeks of isolation, prisoners often began talking to themselves just to hear human voices. After months, many developed elaborate fantasy relationships with imaginary companions. After years, the line between reality and imagination often disappeared entirely. Medieval records include accounts of prisoners who were eventually released after long periods of dungeon confinement, and their descriptions of readjusting to normal life are heartbreaking. Many had difficulty with basic social interactions after months or years without human contact. Some had developed such severe agoraphobia that they couldn't tolerate open spaces. Others had become so accustomed to darkness that normal lighting was physically painful. The physical deterioration was just as systematic as the psychological damage. Without exercise, proper nutrition, or sunlight, prisoners' bodies would gradually waste away, muscles would atrophy, bones would become brittle, and skin would become pale and sensitive. Many prisoners emerged from long-term confinement looking like living skeletons, barely recognizable as the people they'd been when imprisoned. But dungeons weren't just for common criminals or political prisoners. Medieval society had developed special punishments for special crimes, particularly those that threatened the very foundation of royal authority. Treason against the crown wasn't just a crime. It was seen as an attack on God's chosen representative on earth, and it earned punishments that made ordinary torture look merciful.
Have you ever said anything negative about your government? Maybe complained about taxes, or criticized a political leader, or suggested that maybe the people in charge don't always know what they're doing? If you answered yes, congratulations, you would have been guilty of treason in medieval times, and about to discover some truly spectacular ways to die. Special torture for betrayers. Treason in medieval times wasn't just about plotting to kill the king. It was defined so broadly that almost any criticism or disobedience could qualify. Speaking against royal policies. Treason, refusing to pay excessive taxes. Treason, suggesting that maybe the king wasn't divinely appointed. Super treason with extra punishment. The reason treason was treated so seriously was theological as much as political. Medieval Christian doctrine held that kings were appointed by God himself, making them God's representatives on earth. This meant that betraying the king wasn't just a political crime, it was a sin against God that threatened the very foundation of Christian society. And medieval punishment for treason reflected this cosmic importance. Let's meet Sir Geoffrey the Accidentally Treasonous. Geoffrey was a minor nobleman who made the mistake of suggesting after a few too many cups of wine at a feast that maybe the king's latest tax increase was a bit excessive and perhaps the money would be better spent on actually defending the realm, rather than funding royal hunting expeditions. This seemed like reasonable political commentary to Geoffrey, but it was interpreted as questioning the king's divine wisdom, which made it textbook treason. Geoffrey's arrest would be dramatic and public. Royal guards would surround his manor at dawn, not just to ensure he couldn't escape, but to send a message to anyone else who might be harboring treasonous thoughts. His property would be seized immediately, not just as punishment but to prevent him from using his wealth to organize resistance or buy his way out of trouble. The charges against Geoffrey would be read publicly in every major town and city, ensuring that everyone knew what he'd done and what was going to happen to him. This wasn't just about punishing Geoffrey, it was about educating the entire population about the consequences of disloyalty to the crown. Geoffrey's trial would be a foregone conclusion, but it would be conducted with elaborate ceremony to demonstrate the crown's commitment to justice. He'd be allowed to speak in his defense, not because anyone cared about his explanations, but because letting him condemn himself with his own words would make the eventual punishment seem more justified. The torture phase would be particularly intensive for treason cases. The authorities wouldn't just want a confession, they'd want names of co-conspirators, details of plots, and information about anyone else who might be harboring disloyal thoughts. Geoffrey would be introduced to every device in the torture chamber, and his sessions would continue until the torturers were satisfied they'd extracted every piece of potentially useful information. But here's where treason punishment gets truly creative. It wasn't enough to simply kill traitors. Medieval monarchs wanted to destroy them so completely that they'd serve as permanent warnings to future generations about the consequences of betrayal. The traitor's mark of shame. The punishment for high treason was specifically designed to be the most horrifying death imaginable, combining maximum pain with maximum humiliation and lasting terror for spectators. This was called hanging, drawing, and quartering, and it was as awful as it sounds. The condemned traitor would first be dragged through the streets on a hurdle, a wooden frame that bounced and scraped over cobblestones, ensuring maximum discomfort and public humiliation. The dragging wasn't meant to kill, just to rough up the prisoner and give everyone a chance to see what happened to traitors. Then came the hanging phase, but not the quick neck-breaking kind of hanging used for ordinary criminals. Traitors were hanged slowly, just long enough to bring them to the edge of death from strangulation, but not long enough to actually kill them. They'd be cut down while still alive, gasping and struggling for the next phase of their punishment. The drawing phase involved disembowelment while the victim was still conscious. The executioner would cut open the traitor's abdomen and slowly remove their internal organs, often burning them in front of the dying person. This wasn't just about causing pain, it was about destroying the body in a way that medieval people believed would interfere with resurrection on Judgment Day. Finally came quartering. The body would be cut into 4 pieces, the quarters, with the head removed separate. These 5 pieces would then be displayed in different locations around the kingdom. The head on London Bridge, or the Tower of London. The quarters on city gates or important crossroads. The display wasn't temporary. These body parts would remain on public view until they rotted away completely, sometimes taking months or years. The message was clear: this is what happens to people who betray their king, and their punishment continues even after death. The displays served as constant reminders of royal power and the consequences of resistance. Travelers would see them when entering cities, merchants would pass them daily, and children would grow up with these grisly warnings as permanent fixtures of their landscape. The psychological impact on family members was devastating. Geoffrey's wife and children would have to live with the knowledge that pieces of their husband and father were rotting on display for everyone to see. They'd be permanently marked as the family of a traitor, making marriage prospects difficult for children and social relationships nearly impossible for survivors. Property confiscation was total and permanent. Geoffrey's lands, money, titles, and possessions would all revert to the crown. His family would be left destitute, forcing them to rely on charity or distant relatives who might be reluctant to associate with traitors' families. The economic punishment extended the suffering far beyond Geoffrey himself. Curses that lasted generations. But medieval punishment for treason didn't stop with the execution of the primary offender. The concept of corruption of blood meant that the traitor's descendants would also be permanently tainted by their ancestors' crime. Geoffrey's children and grandchildren would be legally barred from inheriting titles, owning land, or holding positions of authority. The punishment was designed to destroy entire bloodlines, not just individuals. This hereditary punishment created what were essentially permanent outcast families. Generations of people would suffer because of one ancestor's moment of political miscalculation. Children would grow up knowing they could never aspire to the social positions their birth might otherwise have entitled them to, all because great-grandfather Geoffrey had won too many drinks and shared his opinions about taxation policy. The social isolation was complete and lasting. Other noble families would avoid associating with traitors' descendants, partly out of genuine revulsion and partly out of fear that such association might raise questions about their own loyalty. Marriages between traitors' families and loyal families were strongly discouraged,
and sometimes explicitly forbidden. Some families tried to rehabilitate themselves through particularly enthusiastic loyalty to the crown. They'd volunteer for dangerous military service, provide lavish financial support for royal projects, or actively inform on other potentially disloyal subjects. But even these efforts might be viewed suspiciously. After all, if their family had produced one traitor, how could anyone be sure they weren't just better at hiding their true feelings? The records were kept meticulous. Medieval bureaucracy might have been primitive in many ways, but they were excellent at maintaining lists of who was descended from whom, ensuring that even remote connections to historical traitors could be tracked and used against people generations later. Royal genealogists could trace bloodlines back centuries when it served political purposes. Religious consequences were just as severe as legal ones. Traitors were often denied Christian burial, meaning their souls were believed to be damned for eternity. Their families would be barred from certain religious ceremonies, and might be refused communion or other sacraments. In a society where religious salvation was the ultimate goal, this spiritual punishment was considered worse than any physical suffering. Some families changed their names and moved to distant regions, hoping to escape their hereditary taint. Others emigrated to different countries entirely. But in the interconnected world of medieval nobility, where bloodlines and family histories were common knowledge, it was nearly impossible to completely escape the consequences of ancestral treason. The fear of these extreme punishments was so effective that it often prevented actual treasonous activity. People who might otherwise have organized legitimate political opposition instead kept their thoughts to themselves, or expressed dissent only in the most private circumstance. The threat of destroying not just themselves but their entire family line for generations was enough to maintain political stability through terror. But royal justice was just one aspect of medieval punishment system. The church had its own courts, its own definitions of crime, and its own very creative approaches to correction and deterrence. Religious authorities claimed jurisdiction over sins as well as crimes, and their punishments often combined physical suffering with spiritual torment in ways that secular courts couldn't match.
Have you ever missed church? Eaten meat on Friday? Had impure thoughts? Questioned any religious teachings? If you answered yes to any of these, congratulations, you would have been a prime candidate for ecclesiastical correction, and about to discover that God's representatives on earth had some very earthly ideas about punishment. Religious courts of terror. The medieval church didn't just handle spiritual matters. It operated an entire parallel legal system with its own courts, its own laws, and its own punishments. Church courts had jurisdiction over what they called sins against God, which was a wonderfully broad category that could include almost any behavior the clergy found objectionable. Let's meet Brother Marcus, a parish priest who committed the apparently heinous sin of questioning whether the local bishop really needed quite so many gold crosses while his parishioners were starving. This seemed like reasonable theological concern to Marcus. After all, didn't Jesus say something about helping the poor? But questioning church hierarchy was considered both heretical and treasonous, making it a perfect crime for ecclesiastical punishment. The church court system was designed to be even more terrifying than secular courts, because it claimed authority over your eternal soul, not just your earthly body. When Brother Marcus was brought before the ecclesiastical tribunal, he wasn't just facing temporal punishment, he was risking eternal damnation, excommunication, and spiritual destruction that would last forever. The judges were high-ranking church officials who wore elaborate robes and spoke in Latin, creating an atmosphere of sacred authority that was designed to intimidate defendants into submission. The proceedings would begin with lengthy prayers asking God to guide the court in determining truth and dispensing justice, making it clear that any resistance to the court's authority was resistance to God himself. The charges against Marcus would be read in both Latin and the local language, ensuring that everyone understood both the specific accusations and their theological implications. The court wouldn't just claim that Marcus had spoken inappropriately. They'd argue that his words demonstrated pride, lack of faith, and potential corruption by Satan himself. Evidence in church courts was evaluated according to different standards than secular court. Accusations by fellow clergy members were given enormous weight, while testimony from lay people was often dismissed as ignorant or misguided. The court could consider dreams, visions, and supposed divine revelations as legitimate evidence, making defense nearly impossible. The questioning phase would focus not just on what Marcus had done, but on the state of his soul. Had he been having doubts about church teachings? Had he been reading unauthorized books? Had he been associating with people who might have influenced him toward heretical thought? The court wanted to root out not just the specific offense, but any underlying spiritual corruption that might have caused it. Forced confessions under torture. Church torture was presented as spiritual medicine rather than punishment. The idea was that physical suffering could purify the soul by burning away sin and forcing the victim to confront their relationship with God. This theological framework allowed church authorities to inflict truly horrific punishments, while claiming they were acting out of love and concern for the victim's eternal welfare. The torture chamber in a monastery or cathedral was often more sophisticated than secular facilities, because the church had better resources and more educated personnel. Church torturers were often educated men who understood anatomy and psychology, making them more effective at extracting confessions while keeping victims alive. The session would begin with prayers asking God to reveal truth through the application of penance. Marcus would be told that his suffering was a form of penance that could actually help save his soul if he accepted it with proper humility and repentance. The torturer would speak calmly about the theological benefits of pain while preparing his instrument. Church torture often focused on symbolic punishments that related to the specific sin. Since Marcus had committed a sin of speech, his tongue might be the primary target. But church torturers also had access to more exotic techniques that secular authorities couldn't use, including psychological tortures that played on religious fears and beliefs. For instance, Marcus might be forced to undergo spiritual trials that combined physical pain with religious terror. He might be made to hold burning religious objects while reciting prayers, or forced to kneel on sharp stones while contemplating images of hell and damnation. The torture was designed to attack both body and soul simultaneously. The confession phase was particularly elaborate in church court. Marcus wouldn't just admit to his specific offense, he'd be required to provide a detailed spiritual autobiography, confessing to every sin he'd ever committed and explaining how Satan had gradually corrupted his soul. This process could take days or weeks, with torture sessions continuing until the court was satisfied with the completeness of his spiritual self-destruction. The psychological manipulation was often more effective than physical torture. Church authorities were experts at exploiting religious guilt and fear, making victims believe that their suffering was deserved and that they were actually helping themselves by cooperating with their tormentor. Many people genuinely believed that confessing under torture would help save their souls, even if it destroyed their earthly lives. Spiritual torment beyond death. But the really diabolical aspect of church punishment was that it didn't end with death. It was designed to continue for all eternity. Excommunication was considered far worse than any physical punishment because it cut the victim off from the sacraments necessary for salvation, essentially guaranteeing that they would spend eternity in hell. Marcus would be formally cast out of the church in a ceremony that was designed to be as terrifying as any execution. He'd be brought before the altar while the congregation watched, and a high-ranking church official would read the formula of excommunication while candles were extinguished one by one, symbolizing the light of God's grace being withdrawn from his soul. The excommunication ceremony concluded with the ringing of bells and the closing of the church book, symbolizing that Marcus's name had been erased from the book of life and that he was now spiritually dead even while physically alive. The congregation would be instructed to treat him as if he were literally dead. No one could speak to him, trade with him, or provide him with assistance of any kind. The social consequences were devastating. Marcus's family would be forced to abandon him to avoid being contaminated by his spiritual corruption. His friends would cross the street to avoid contact. Merchants would refuse to sell him. He would become a living ghost existing in society but cut off from all human relationships and basic services. But excommunication was just the beginning of spiritual punishment. The church taught that excommunicated people became vulnerable to demonic possession, that their prayers would no longer be heard by God, and that every day they continued living added to the punishments they'd face in hell. This created a psychological torture that continued 24 hours a day for the rest of the victim's life. Some excommunicated people became so desperate for readmission to the church that they would accept almost any penance, no matter how extreme. The church would sometimes offer restoration in exchange for humiliating public penances that could last for years. Walking barefoot on pilgrimages, wearing special clothing that identified them as penitents, or performing degrading public confessions on major religious holidays. The records show that some people committed suicide rather than live with excommunication, believing that a quick death was preferable to a lifetime of spiritual isolation followed by eternal damnation. Others fled to distant lands where their excommunication might not be known, essentially becoming religious refugees in search of communities that would accept them. But even in distant lands, the reach of the medieval church was extensive. Letters would be sent to religious authorities warning them about excommunicated individuals,
making it nearly impossible to escape the consequences of church punishment. The network of monasteries, cathedrals and parish churches created an information system that could track spiritual criminals across continents. The theological justification for this extreme punishment was that the church was responsible for protecting the spiritual welfare of all Christians. Allowing heretics and sinners to remain in communion with faithful believers would contaminate the entire community and put everyone's salvation at risk. From the church's perspective, excommunication was a necessary amputation of diseased spiritual tissue to protect the health of the body of Christ. And the really twisted part was that this system often worked exactly as intended. The threat of excommunication was so terrifying that most people would rather suffer any physical punishment than risk spiritual damnation. People would confess to sins they hadn't committed, accept humiliating penances, and submit to church authority completely rather than face the possibility of eternal separation from God. But church punishment was just one aspect of medieval society's approach to social control through terror. All of these various punishment systems, royal, secular and religious, came together in the ultimate expression of medieval justice, the public execution, where entire communities would gather to watch their neighbors die in the name of entertainment, education and social solidarity.
What do you do for entertainment? Netflix? Video games? Sports? Well, imagine living in a world where the highlight of your social calendar was watching your neighbors get brutally killed by professional executioners while you cheered and ate snacks. Ready to appreciate modern entertainment options? The execution square atmosphere. Public executions weren't just legal proceedings. They were elaborate festivals that brought entire communities together for a shared experience of sanctioned violence. The execution square would be transformed into what was essentially a medieval theme park, complete with vendors, entertainment, and prime seating for those who could afford it. The preparation would begin days in advance. Carpenters would construct scaffolds and gallows, ensuring they were tall enough for everyone to see and sturdy enough to support both the execution equipment and the crowds that would inevitably climb on them for better views. The scaffold wasn't just functional, it was designed for maximum visual impact, often decorated with banners, religious symbols, and sometimes even crude artwork depicting the crimes being punished. Vendors would arrive early to claim the best spots for their stall. Food sellers offered everything from meat pies to roasted chestnuts, because nothing worked up an appetite quite like watching someone get their head chopped off. Drink vendors did particularly good business, as many spectators liked to lubricate their throats before doing their share of the cheering. Souvenir merchants sold everything from execution programs for those who could read, to pieces of rope that were claimed to be from previous hanging. The atmosphere was genuinely festive. Children would run around playing games while their parents saved spots with good views. Musicians would perform while the crowd waited for the main event. Pickpockets would work their way through the distracted crowds, sometimes earning themselves a spot at the next execution if they were caught. The whole event had the energy of a modern sporting event or concert, except that the entertainment was a human being dying in agony. Different social classes arranged themselves in a rough hierarchy around the execution site. Nobles and wealthy merchants might have special viewing platforms or reserved areas that gave them the best angles for seeing the action. Middle-class craftsmen and shopkeepers would claim spots based on how early they arrived and how aggressively they defended their territory. Peasants and the poor would pack into whatever spaces remained, often having to watch from considerable distances, or settle for climbing trees and buildings for glimpses of the proceedings. The crowd would provide running commentary throughout the event. He doesn't look sorry enough. She's crying too much. I bet the executioner misses on the first swing. People would make wagers on various aspects of the execution, how many swings it would take to complete a beheading, whether the victim would beg for mercy, how long someone would dance on the gallows before dying. It was like medieval sports betting, except the stakes were literally life and death. Families brought their children. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of public executions was how they were explicitly designed as family entertainment and educational experience. Parents didn't just tolerate their children's presence at executions, they actively encouraged it as an important part of their moral education. The reasoning was beautifully simple. Children needed to learn about the consequences of criminal behavior, and what better way than to see those consequences in action? Watching a thief get his hand chopped off would teach young minds about the importance of respecting other people's property. Seeing a murderer hanged would demonstrate the value of human life and the price of taking it. Observing a heretic burned alive would reinforce the importance of religious orthodoxy and obedience to church authority. Children were often given prime viewing spots specifically because their education was considered so important. Adults would lift them onto their shoulders, explain what was happening,
and encourage them to pay close attention to the moral lessons being demonstrated. See what happens to people who don't follow God's laws. Little Mary, remember this when you're tempted to misbehave. The questions children asked during executions were recorded by some contemporary observers, and they're both heartbreaking and illuminating. Why is that man screaming, "Pup"? Will the bad lady go to heaven now that she's been punished? Can we stay to see if they put his head on a stick? These innocent inquiries reveal how normalized extreme violence had become in medieval society. Some children became fascinated by executions and would beg their parents to take them to every public punishment in the area. Others were traumatized by what they saw and developed lasting fears of authority figures and punishment. But most seemed to accept it as just another part of life, like market days or religious festivals. Unpleasant perhaps, but normal and necessary. The educational aspect was reinforced by the ritual elements of execution. Religious officials would deliver sermons before the punishment began, explaining the theological significance of what was about to happen. The condemned would sometimes be encouraged to address the crowd, warning them not to follow the path that had led to the scaffold. These moral lessons were considered just as important as the physical punishment itself. Teachers and parents would often use execution experiences as the basis for extended moral instruction. Children might be asked to write about what they'd learned from watching someone die, or to explain how the execution reinforced important social and religious principles. The violence became a teaching tool, integrated into the broader educational framework that shaped young minds. Snacks and death shows. The commercial aspect of public executions was extensive and well organized. A major execution could bring thousands of visitors to a town, creating economic opportunities that local merchants were eager to exploit. Entire temporary economies would spring up around execution events, with people traveling from considerable distances to witness particularly notorious criminals meet their end. Food vendors offered execution-specific menus that played on the morbid nature of the entertainment. Meat pies shaped like body parts were popular, as were drinks with names that referenced hanging or beheading. Some vendors sold execution bread that was supposedly baked with flour blessed by priests, giving it special spiritual properties that would protect spectators from the evil influences of witnessing violence. Accommodation providers did excellent business during major execution. Inns would be booked solid with visitors who had traveled to see famous criminals executed. Homeowners would rent out rooms, barn space, or even just places to sleep in their yards. The temporary population surge could double or triple a town's size during particularly notable executions. Souvenir sales were surprisingly sophisticated. Vendors sold pieces of rope from previous hangings, splinters of wood from scaffolds where famous criminals had died, and even small bottles of dirt from execution sites. These items were believed to have protective or medicinal properties. A piece of a murderer's rope might protect you from violence, while dirt from an execution ground could cure certain ailments when properly applied. The betting markets were complex and well organized. Professional gamblers would set odds on various aspects of the execution and take wagers from spectators. You could bet on whether the condemned would confess, how long the execution would take, whether the executioner would need multiple attempts, or even what the victim's last words would be. Some bets were settled immediately, while others might not be resolved until days later when the body's behavior could be fully observed. Entertainment beyond the execution itself was also provided. Musicians would perform before and after the main event. Storytellers would recount the criminal's life and crimes for those who might have missed earlier announcements. Sometimes there would be subsidiary punishments, lesser criminals receiving floggings or having their ears cropped, that served as appetizers for the main course of execution. The cleanup after executions was also commercialized. The blood-soaked earth around scaffolds was collected and sold for its supposed magical properties. Pieces of clothing worn by the condemned were cut up and distributed as relics. Even the executioner's tools might be rented out to people who wanted to pose with them for commemorative purposes. But perhaps the most telling aspect of execution entertainment was how it brought communities together across social divisions that normally kept people apart. Rich and poor, educated and illiterate, pious and sinful, everyone came together to share in the spectacle of sanctioned violence. These events created temporary social unity based on collective participation in someone else's suffering. The shared experience of watching executions became part of community identity. People would remember particular executions for decades afterward, sharing stories about especially dramatic deaths or comparing different executioners' techniques. These memories became part of local folklore, passed down through generations as cautionary tales and entertainment simultaneously. And yet, even as medieval society perfected the art of turning death into entertainment, there were signs that this system couldn't last forever. Gradually, some people began to question whether public torture and execution were really necessary for maintaining order. New ideas about justice, mercy, and human dignity started to emerge, eventually leading to the collapse of the entire medieval punishment system.
Have you ever stood up for someone who was being treated unfairly? Have you ever questioned whether a punishment was too harsh for the crime? Have you ever felt that basic human dignity should be respected even when someone has done wrong? If so, congratulations, you have the same moral instincts that eventually brought down the entire medieval system of sanctioned torture and public brutality. The first glimpse of humanity, the collapse of medieval punishment, didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that took centuries and faced enormous resistance from entrenched authorities who had built their power on the foundation of fear and violence. But it began with individuals who looked at the system around them and had the courage to say, "This is wrong." One of the earliest challenges came from an unexpected source: practical economics. By the late medieval period, communities were beginning to realize that the current punishment system was actually quite expensive and inefficient. Maintaining torture equipment, paying executioners, and dealing with the economic disruption caused by public executions was a significant drain on local resources. More importantly, killing and maiming people removed them from the labor force permanently, which was problematic in societies that were often short of workers. Some forward-thinking administrators began to question whether there might be more cost-effective approaches to dealing with crime. Instead of cutting off thieves' hands, which made them unable to work and therefore more likely to steal again, why not put them to hard labor that would benefit the community while deterring future crime? Instead of burning heretics alive, which was expensive and time-consuming, why not find ways to reintegrate them into society after appropriate penance? These practical considerations opened small cracks in the ideological foundation of medieval punishment. Once people started thinking about efficiency and effectiveness rather than just tradition and terror, other questions naturally followed. If the goal was deterrence, were public tortures actually working? If the goal was justice, were the punishments proportional to the crime? If the goal was community safety, were there better ways to achieve it? Religious reform movements also played a crucial role in challenging the punishment system. Some Christian reformers began to emphasize Jesus' teachings about mercy, forgiveness, and redemption rather than focusing exclusively on divine wrath and eternal punishment. These reformers argued that true Christian justice should offer opportunities for repentance and rehabilitation, not just vengeance and terror. The Franciscan and Dominican orders in particular began to develop new approaches to dealing with crime and sin that emphasized spiritual healing rather than physical destruction. They established programs for helping criminals reintegrate into society, created alternatives to corporal punishment, and argued that God's mercy was more powerful than human cruelty in transforming hearts and minds. Academic institutions also contributed to the gradual shift in thinking about justice. Universities began to produce scholars who had studied classical texts about law, ethics, and governance. These educated men, and a few women, brought new intellectual frameworks to bear on traditional practices, asking whether ancient Greek and Roman approaches to justice might offer better models than medieval brutality. Early reform attempts. The first systematic attempts at punishment reform emerged in the late medieval period, usually in response to specific abuses that had become too extreme for even medieval sensibilities to tolerate. These early reforms were modest and often faced fierce resistance, but they established important precedents for later, more comprehensive changes. One of the earliest areas of reform involved torture procedure. Some jurisdictions began to establish rules about when torture could be used, how long it could continue, and what methods were acceptable. These weren't humanitarian reforms exactly. They were more about ensuring that torture remained an effective tool for extracting confessions rather than just an outlet for sadistic impulse. For instance, some courts began to require that multiple officials be present during torture sessions, partly to ensure proper procedures were followed, and partly to prevent individual torturers from exceeding authorized limits. Others established rules about medical care for torture victims, not out of compassion but to ensure that suspects remained healthy enough to provide useful information. Prison conditions also began to improve gradually, though again the motivations were often practical rather than humanitarian. Administrators realized that prisoners who died from disease or neglect before their trials couldn't provide information about their crimes or accomplices. Some facilities began to provide basic medical care, adequate food, and marginally better sanitation,
not because they cared about prisoners' welfare, but because healthier prisoners were more useful prisoners. The treatment of women and children in the justice system began to receive special attention from reform-minded officials. Some jurisdictions established separate facilities for female prisoners, recognizing that housing men and women together led to problems that interfered with the administration of justice. Others began to question whether very young children should be subject to the same punishments as adults, leading to the development of modified penalties for juvenile offenders. Legal procedures also underwent gradual reform. Some courts began to allow defendants to have advocates or advisors during their trials, recognizing that this might actually make the legal process more efficient by ensuring that all relevant information was presented. Others established appeal processes that allowed higher courts to review lower courts' decisions, partly as a check on local corruption and partly to ensure consistency in legal interpretation. The role of confession in criminal proceedings began to evolve as well. Some legal scholars argued that confessions extracted under extreme torture might not be reliable, and that alternative methods of determining guilt might be more effective. This led to experiments with different investigative techniques and evidence-gathering procedures that didn't rely entirely on forcing suspects to incriminate themselves. The dawn of modern justice. The transformation from medieval brutality to modern legal systems was neither quick nor complete, and it faced enormous resistance from established authorities who had invested their careers and identities in the old system. But gradually, new ideas about human dignity, legal fairness, and effective governance began to take hold in European societies. The Renaissance brought new intellectual currents that challenged many medieval assumptions. Humanist scholars argued that human beings had inherent worth that shouldn't be destroyed by excessive punishment. Legal theorists developed new frameworks for thinking about crime and punishment that emphasized rehabilitation and deterrence rather than just vengeance and terror. The Protestant Reformation also contributed to changes in punishment philosophy, though in complex and sometimes contradictory ways. While some Protestant communities became even more rigid about punishment for religious crimes, others embraced ideas about individual conscience and divine mercy that led to more humane treatment of offenders. The fragmentation of religious authority also meant that no single institution could impose uniform punishment practices across entire regions. Economic changes played a crucial role in the transformation as well. As trade expanded and labor became more valuable, communities became less willing to destroy their human resources through excessive punishment. The rise of capitalism created new incentives for keeping people alive and productive rather than killing or maiming them for relatively minor offenses. Political centralization also contributed to punishment reform. As kingdoms became more centralized and professional, local lords and officials lost some of their arbitrary power to punish as they saw fit. Royal courts began to establish more consistent standards for justice, partly to ensure political stability and partly to prevent local abuses that might undermine royal authority. The development of printing technology had a profound impact on legal reform as well. Legal codes could be published and distributed widely, making laws more consistent and predictable. Accounts of legal proceedings could be recorded and shared, allowing for comparison and criticism of different approaches to justice. Ideas about legal reform could spread rapidly across great distances, creating networks of reform-minded officials and scholars. Scientific advances also influenced thinking about punishment. As medical knowledge improved, people began to understand more about human anatomy and physiology, leading to questions about the effectiveness and humanity of various torture techniques. As psychology developed as a field of study, scholars began to investigate the mental effects of different types of punishment, leading to new ideas about rehabilitation and deterrence. But perhaps most importantly, the gradual expansion of literacy and education created larger populations of people who were capable of thinking critically about traditional practices. As more people learned to read and write, they gained access to alternative ideas about justice, governance, and human rights. This created growing pressure for legal systems that were more rational, consistent, and humane than medieval practice. The transformation wasn't complete or uniform. Traces of medieval punishment philosophy persisted well into the modern era, and some aspects never disappeared entirely. But by the end of the medieval period, the foundations had been laid for legal systems that recognized basic human rights, emphasized proportional punishment, and sought to balance justice with mercy. And now, as we reach the end of our journey through the darkest aspects of medieval justice, it's time to reflect on what we've learned and why it matters for understanding both our past and our present. Because while we may congratulate ourselves on leaving medieval brutality behind, the human capacity for cruelty and the need for constant vigilance in protecting human dignity are lessons that remain relevant today.
Well, my brave companions in medieval misery, we've reached the end of our absolutely delightful journey through the wonderful world of medieval punishment. If you've stuck with me through all 15 chapters of torture devices, public executions, and creative cruelty, you deserve a medal, or at least a good therapist and some very strong coffee. Let's take a moment to appreciate what we've learnt together, shall we? We've discovered that medieval people were remarkably creative when it came to hurting each other, that justice was whatever the person in charge decided it was on any given day, and that public entertainment used to involve a lot more screaming and significantly less Netflix, story summary and reflection. So what can we take away from this charming tour through history's greatest hits of human cruelty? First and most obviously, we should all wake up every morning and thank whatever deities we believe in that we weren't born in medieval Europe. Seriously, the next time you complain about a parking ticket or a court appearance, remember that you could be having your tongue pierced with red-hot irons, or your joints systematically dislocated on a rack. But beyond the obvious thank goodness for modern civilization takeaway, there are deeper lessons here about human nature, social control, and the importance of protecting basic human rights. Medieval punishment systems didn't develop because medieval people were inherently more evil than we are. They developed because societies built on extreme inequality and absolute authority need extreme methods to maintain that inequality and authority. Every torture device we discussed, every brutal execution we explored, every humiliating punishment we examined, served the same basic function, reminding everyone exactly what happened to people who stepped out of line. The rack wasn't just about extracting confessions, it was about terrorizing potential dissidents. Public executions weren't just about punishing criminals, they were about creating shared experiences that reinforced social hierarchies. The scold's bridle wasn't just about punishing mouthy women, it was about maintaining gender-based power structures through fear and humiliation. These systems worked, in their own horrible way. Medieval societies were remarkably stable and orderly, not because people were naturally well behaved, but because everyone had seen exactly what happened to people who misbehaved. When the consequences of dissent include having your joints pulled apart while crowds cheer, most people choose compliance over resistance. The transformation to more humane legal systems didn't happen because humans suddenly became more moral. It happened because societies developed that were secure enough in their legitimacy that they didn't need to rely on terror to maintain order. When governments derive their authority from consent rather than conquest, when social mobility becomes possible, when basic rights are protected by law rather than dependent on the whims of local authorities, extreme punishment becomes both unnecessary and counterproductive. Grateful for modern life. Think about your daily life for a moment. You can criticize your government without being tortured. You can practice whatever religion you choose without being burned alive. You can live alone, own cats, know about herbs, and have opinions without being accused of witchcraft. You can steal a loaf of bread without losing your hand. You can speak your mind without having metal cages locked onto your head. These aren't just conveniences, they're miraculous achievements that represent centuries of human struggle against systems of oppression and cruelty. Every right you take for granted was won through the efforts of people who risked everything to challenge authoritarian systems and demand basic human dignity. Your local courthouse, with its boring procedures and constitutional protections, represents one of humanity's greatest victories over its own worst impulses. Your right to legal representation, your presumption of innocence, your protection from cruel and unusual punishment, these are hard-won bulwarks against the kind of casual brutality that characterized medieval justice. Even our prison systems, flawed as they often are, represent enormous progress over medieval dungeons. The idea that punishment should be proportional to crimes, that prisoners retain basic human rights, that rehabilitation is possible, these concepts would have been incomprehensible to medieval authorities who saw criminals as irredeemably corrupted beings who deserved whatever suffering could be inflicted upon them. The fact that we can have debates about criminal justice, that we can criticize harsh sentencing, that we can advocate for prisoners' rights, all of this is possible only because we've moved beyond the medieval assumption that authority figures have unlimited power to inflict suffering on those under their control. Humorous farewells, subscribe, like, and now, my fellow survivors of medieval madness, it's time for me to let you go back to your wonderfully boring modern lives where the most exciting thing that's likely to happen to you legally is getting a speeding ticket that you can actually contest in court without risking permanent disfigurement. I hope you've enjoyed our little journey through the absolute worst of human creativity when it comes to hurting each other. I hope you've learned to appreciate your Netflix subscription, your comfortable bed, your modern healthcare, and your remarkable freedom to complain about things without being tortured to death for it. But most importantly, I hope you'll remember that the progress we've made isn't permanent or guaranteed.
Human rights, legal protections and basic human dignity are fragile achievements that require constant vigilance to maintain. The same impulses that created medieval punishment systems, the desire for absolute power, the willingness to dehumanize others, the belief that cruelty is justified in service of ideology, still exist in human nature today. So as you drift off to sleep tonight in your comfortable, torture device-free bedroom, maybe spare a thought for all the people throughout history who suffered and died to create the world you get to live in, and maybe consider what you can do to ensure that future generations inherit a world that's even more just, more humane, and more respectful of basic human dignity than the one you've inherited. Now, if you've somehow managed to stay awake through this entire medieval horror show, you clearly have either exceptional stamina or some very questionable entertainment preferences. Either way, I appreciate your dedication. If you enjoyed learning about the absolute worst of human behavior, and who doesn't love a good torture chamber tour, maybe consider hitting that like button to let me know that my disturbing historical knowledge has been put to good use. And if you're the kind of person who enjoys falling asleep to stories about people getting their joints systematically dislocated, you might want to subscribe for more delightfully dark historical content. I've got plenty more stories about humanity's greatest hits of cruelty, stupidity and general awfulness just waiting to be shared. But for now, sweet dream. And remember, if you have any nightmares about racks, iron maidens or scold's bridals, just remind yourself that you live in the 21st century, where the most medieval thing you're likely to encounter is a Renaissance fair, and even those have proper bathroom facilities and safety regulation. Sleep tight and try not to let the medieval torture devices bite, because in our modern world they can't actually bite you. Progress is a beautiful thing.